expertise is really helping new partnerships form, especially around conservation and community development issues, especially controversial issues is one of my specialty. And not that these are controversial, but that partnerships really do bring out those tensions within groups, because you want those diverse partnerships so that you can successfully implement these ambitious projects. So I just want to say the design and setup of this program and the ability to compare across these different partnerships is such a rich opportunity for learning. So kudos to you all for seeing that opportunity and really taking advantage of it. And I did want to thank Courtney Schaff for being an awesome partner in this work and really touching base and working with me regularly to reflect on what are the most salient findings to the work that you all are doing and to the partnerships themselves. And also Robert Warren from Bonneville Environmental Foundation playing that role as a frequent check-in and really reflecting on the meaning of this work. So the project is formed around two guiding questions. The first, what do partnerships need to be resilient and maintain a high level of performance? So this really addresses what do the partnerships need, and this is relevant to partnerships, addressing all different sorts of issues, but particularly in the world of restoration and conservation. So I think this will be useful to many partnerships outside of the ones you're funding even. And then the second question, how can OWEB improve and innovate the Focused Investment Partnership Program to better support those high-performing partnerships and contribute to their resilience, to make that progress toward desired ecological outcomes? So the first part focused on the partnerships, and the second part focused on what can those funding programs look like to support success. So far, I've listened and learned from the 8 capacity building FIP grantees from those 8 partnerships. This is the first part of this study, and I started in October and went through April of this year. And I attended partnership meetings from each of the 8 partnerships. I conducted in-depth interviews with 17 partners across the 8 partnerships, and I received 80 survey responses. That was an electronic survey that we designed with both quantitative ranking questions that were real quick and easy for people to answer, and a fair number of open-ended questions that asked people to elaborate on, reflect both on how the partnership operates in terms of a series of different aspects of looking at partnership operations and governance, communications, but also thinking about the FIP program and their interaction with it and any feedback they might have. All of my interactions with the partnerships were completely confidential, so the findings that I'm going to report aren't linked to any one partnership. The desire was to roll up these findings across the partnerships, and that encouraged those partnerships to feel comfortable sharing and being real genuine with the challenges they were facing and their feedback and input. So this is the part 1 of this project. Part 2 will start this fall, probably in September, as I start reaching out to the implementation FIP grantees. So I think, these are some really rich findings that have come out of just these first 8 partnerships, but as I work with the implementation partnerships, I think we'll really deepen the findings with respect to the actual implementing the restoration projects. And just to remind you which those 8 partnerships that I've worked with so far, I'm going to read them off from kind of south to north and then across the top of the state. Rogue Basin Partnership, Wild Rivers Coast Estuary, Umpqua Basin Partnership, Siuslaw-Coho Partnership, Oregon Central Coast Estuary Collaborative, Clackamas Partnership, John Day Basin Partnership, and the Wallowa Fish Habitat Restoration Partnership. And as you can imagine, these are quite diverse partnerships in the geographics area they cover, the scope and breadth of issues that they're focused on, the number of partners at the table. They also differ in the formalization of their partnership and in the presence of other, people refer to them as anchor funders. So that made a big difference in terms of the history, where they've come from and their future trajectory, where they're going. So it's just useful to note. And in the report, I do highlight quite a few aspects of diversity. So you can look up in the report if you're interested in any of these pieces. But I'm really just going to try to touch on highlights as we move through and allow plenty of time for discussion. So it's useful before we dive into the findings to talk a little bit about partnerships. And partnerships are networks of people and organizations working together to advance shared interests. But to put a finer point on that, we can think about partnerships along a continuum from more autonomous at the left end, for example, information networks, which could simply be colleagues coming together periodically like a professional association or periodic regional conferences. And then as you move further towards the right, those partners become more interdependent. And so the example of cooperating partnerships would be partners that come together for specific projects or specific time periods. So for those projects, they're aligned and have different tasks, usually more task-oriented, and then they may go their separate ways. So the autonomy of the individual organizations is still very much maintained. But as you move further towards the right of this diagram, the coordinating partnerships, that's when you really get partners start to think, how can we adjust our internal priorities and operations to try to complement and build towards these larger, longer-term collaborative efforts. And then as you move all the way to the right, the collaborating partnership is where organizations really see themselves as having particular niches or roles and that they function better together. So as you move from left to right, the intensity of the linkages among partners increases. So do the costs of governance and communication to keep the partnership coordinated, to keep people aligned, and to make sure that those partners at the table are communicating up the chains through their organizations so that the senior leadership of the individual partner organizations are on board. And also the more risk that individual partners take on, because as you move from left to right, each partner is committing more and more to the greater good or that whole vision as opposed to their own internal priorities. And so individual organizations may see that as a risk because they'll have to let go of some of their way of doing things or their internal priorities for the good of that greater vision. But the value is really that then you can really think about how to piece together different aspects of capacity and really accomplish more complex goals and more complex vision. And so I introduced this because often people don't have this finer tuned vision, and in our society, collaboration is really heralded as a solution to many of these complex problems in society, and people often jump into a collaborative arrangement without really realizing what it asks of them. So I find that this simple diagram can help people kind of wrap their heads around where they might fall on this continuum. I also like to talk about it in terms of a value proposition. Right, so what are the costs and risks to each partner along this continuum, and what is that perceived value? Whether people realize it or not, they're doing it every time they sit down to a table and negotiate or collaborate together with other partners. And those partners who have more kind of concerns or are focused more on the risks and costs may sit backwards from the table a little bit, may sit at a little distance and kind of track and watch how things are going. And when they see that value or that benefit of the, we can do more together than individually, then all of a sudden they'll pull their chair a little bit closer and you'll get more commitment and buy-in. And so that's a natural process that happens, and just showing this diagram and helping people to think through it, I think just helps people become more aware of a natural process. And so as these partnerships, the partnerships I talked to all received the capacity building FIP grants, and those paid for support to go through the strategic action planning process and to fine-tune governance documents of how the partnership will work, and also start to do outreach around the planning process. And so as these partnerships came together, many of them had been working together for many years, but the idea was they could do more by formalizing or taking their partnership up to this extra notch. And a real common sentiment about the value proposition of the partnership was this ability to more intentionally become more collaborative, so move towards the right of that spectrum. And I'm just going to read a few quotes here, and again, they're not attributed because these were all confidential interactions with the partners. A big part of the motivation was working together in a more strategic way so that we could attract larger funding into the basin. The message was loud and clear that funders didn't want to fund single entities focused on single actions. If we wanted to get the work done that we wanted, then we had to work in a different way. So this is one of the partnerships and one of the partners that was really aimed on seeing the value of working in a different way. So really moving very strongly towards the right end of that spectrum. We want to shift the way our organizations work together. So jumping into the findings, I'm just reminding you of that first question. What do partnerships need to be resilient and maintain a high level of performance? First, I'm going to focus on what it takes to build a partnership. The partnerships, most of them talked about really this relationship building and organizational development phase that takes 1 to 3 years. So most of these had, talked about going through this process in their past. And then it takes a lot longer than you would expect, when somebody first says, let's work together in a more coordinated, collaborative way. And then there's the cyclical process of addressing doubts and fears, reassuring partners of the value proposition of the partnership. And that's that process of people pulling their chair a little bit back and then pulling it a little bit forward. And a lot of the coordinators or leaders of these partnerships in particular talked about the frustration of this, as it was, their job to emphasize listening, dialogue, serve as a liaison among different partners who maybe had different ideas of where things were going or concerns, and encourage the group to be patient. One of the partnerships I worked with actually in Washington used to encourage with the phrase urgent patience, or patient urgency. This idea that yes, we need to move things forward and keep the urgency at the table, but also have patience with each other. And as I spoke to some of the partners even and reflected that, this is a common experience of people leading these partnerships, there was kind of like an aha, like, oh, what a relief. It just makes me feel better hearing that because I thought it was just my partnership. So I think immediately that's some of the value of doing this partnership learning project is it really helps the different partnerships to put in context their own experience. And one of the findings I found particularly that came out very strongly was that those partner organizations that went through strategic planning about 1 to 3 years before this capacity building grant opportunity really had that clarity to say, this partnership has value, I understand the value proposition, I'm pulling my chair up, and I'm actually even going to play a leadership role at the table. And so those organizations that maybe didn't have that internal organizational clarity, had more kind of hesitation about where they should put their chair, how committed they were to the partnership and the value proposition. What it takes to build a partnership also means figuring out how to make decisions together. And I'm going to say this is common to all partnerships, not just these that I spoke with. I work with all sorts of partnerships, and it's very common, for example, for a partnership to write in their partnership manual or governance documents, we'll make consensus decisions together. But when you actually get to the table, what does that mean? Which type of decisions do we make consensus decisions about? How do we practice consensus? And I always call it like building your collaborative muscles. And so a lot of the groups were figuring out how to do this. And often that vision of collaboration, again, kind of is way out in front, but the actual practice of it, it takes some learning together to perfect that. And then it definitely takes capacity to coordinate the partnership, to work through the governance issues, and for the individual partners to have enough capacity to participate to the depth that will really make the partnership move forward. And so I'm going to touch on a few elements of a resilient partnership, and I have them listed here, but I'm going to walk through each one of them. Capacity to partner, this was a common theme among especially watershed councils, smaller organizations like watershed councils, conservation districts, some of the tribes, and some like small organizations like landowner associations. And they very much appreciated, even sometimes they were just modest contributions to their capacity, but it really meant a lot to them and meant that they could kind of raise their participation and their involvement. Funding for capacity is the thing that could make or break watershed-wide efforts. If you really want that long-term success, there has to be attention to the work that isn't clearly associated with just one project. That's what this grant allows. It is wonderful thinking ahead to provide that. The next step is how can we support the success and continuation of this effort in a way that is not project-specific, but still feeding that goal of on-the-ground restoration, right? And that's the question I know that you all struggle with as well, but just the idea that this capacity was critical. Tribal engagement was another important piece, thinking about resilience. Tribes took on the full range of roles, from leadership or convening role to core partner to intermediary, helping to bring different partners together, especially because of the triple bottom line of social, environmental, and economic sustainability. So they were able to kind of resonate with different stakeholders based on those different perspectives. But they also talked a lot about the learning curve, both the tribal partners and the non-tribal partners, of before this opportunity really helped them deepen those relationships with the tribes and really understand what some of those interests were and learn about how to best engage with the tribes. And I'm going to share a quote here from one of the tribal partners. The general understanding of the partners, understanding of the tribe's role, is an interesting concept. Not many people understand how the tribe manages their resources, and all tribes are different. Out of everyone in the room, the tribe has been there the longest and probably will be there the longest. The impacts will be seen and heard the longest. Having people understand our role is a challenge sometimes, and people don't understand the tremendous landscape that we cover, multiple counties and millions of acres, as opposed to a single watershed or jurisdiction. Other aspects of kind of the complexity of tribal engagement that people talked about not understanding, but really learning about through this process of refining the partnership was understanding how to get support from tribal leadership and the process and the time that takes, and understanding some of the relationships between tribes that might be participating in the same partnership, and how that in some cases makes the partnership more complex if you don't understand those relationships. Governance is another topic worth talking about. It refers to how partners define their roles, partnership operations, and decision-making. Governance discussions provide an opportunity for trust building and deepening relationships. And the tribal issue, again, was a key one, that there was a lot of learning just in developing the MOU or partnership documents, and people saw that as an opportunity to further understand and engage those tribal relationships. However, many partnerships can perform quite well based on informal relationships or informal structures, especially when those relationships are long-standing, based on trust. Communication can be really strong, and you actually don't need to focus as much on governance. But I would say that partnerships then are vulnerable to undercurrents of resistance, so some people kind of violently pulling their chair back all of a sudden from that collaborative table and trying to figure out how to manage that, or destabilizing conflict in the group if all of a sudden there's kind of a controversial issue where people feel differently, or changes in leadership, as you all talked about yesterday with respect to that watershed council. Then all of a sudden, without having that governance kind of foundation, that it can be destabilizing for these partnerships. And so it is useful, even for those informal partnerships. And as they try to do things that are more complex, more ambitious, their goals, again, even those informal partnerships that have worked so well informally for so long really can benefit from talking about governance and partner roles, for example. Yet too much emphasis on governance can drag a group down, so I kind of referred to it as right-sizing. That's been a kind of word that a lot of people have been using lately. So it's not one size fits all. It's really thinking about what level of governance or what emphasis or amount of conversation to spend on identifying roles and talking about how decisions are going to make. And that open communication within a partnership is crucial to doing that. Centralized resources also came out as an important part for thinking about the resilience of these partnerships. And I highlight here GIS and IT support, and some people call them the linchpin that was really needed to make these efforts, work, both in terms of maps for outreach, printing out maps, as well as doing some of the technical GIS analyses, like for climate scenario planning to develop their strategic action plans. And these are difficult for small organizations to have in-house, especially in rural areas. Some of the partnerships talked about the challenge of attracting people with these kind of very high skill sets or specific skill sets. There were some successes in kind of fee-for-services agreements among partners, and in some cases, federal partners, like the Forest Service, provided some of that expertise in kind. But consultants are expensive. Some of the capacity building grantees, they spent a chunk of their capacity building grants on GIS consultants and said that it was more expensive than they expected, and they could have used more funding even still, and if they can get more funding, they may do some more analysis. And a few partners sprinkled throughout from different places suggested, hey, could OWEB play that role and provide some kind of regional GIS service that different partners could tap into? Perhaps there are other centralized resources that could be provided at a regional scale in that way, but the GIS and IT was one that came out right away. Transitioning from planning to implementation, so all of the partnerships I talked about, their feet were firmly in the planning, although maybe one or two were already starting to bridge into implementation. And a lot of people talked about this transition with anticipation, awkwardness, nervousness, and excitement. The idea that you can only invest so much energy in planning, but people really have their eye on that implementation. Once we start having implementation money and ranking projects, it will take on a different tone for the partnership. That will be challenging as the partnership changes. People emphasize the importance of facilitators to walk through some of these difficult conversations, especially about priorities and funding, especially to get those younger professionals on board or those smaller organizations. Often they felt like they could easily be overpowered by the more senior professionals in the group or by very powerful, for example, regional or national environmental groups participating, or organizations with just more staff and capacity. Funding gaps limited key actions. So some of the partnerships talked about they wanted to hire a coordinator to really move towards implementation, but nobody wanted to go through that process without a sustainable funding plan or longer-term funding for that coordinator. And even as small as registering a website domain, which does not cost very much, but in one partnership, no organization wanted to step up and make that investment because they weren't sure what that long-term effort was going to look like. And so kind of waiting to get that implementation funding before fully launching into some of those commitments. And that concern that without implementation funding, partners may lose interest. So especially the coordinators of these partnerships were really focused on how can I get that implementation funding to start flowing to support the partnership. And again, thinking about that spectrum of partnership types, the more you move towards the collaborative end of the spectrum, the more you're going to have those ongoing costs for coordination and communication within the partnership as well as externally. So people are kind of thinking about how are we going to hold this together? We need that implementation funding. And some of the partnerships really emphasized their strong desire, or why, again, thinking about the value proposition, they were moving in this direction was to get to that diversified fundraising. What we're really trying to get people to do is to jump boundaries and look for money. And that's really kind of part of the value proposition, that this can be more effective in getting the money to do the work that would make the difference. Yet there were concerns about how collaborative fundraising would affect individual fundraising. Again, some of those cycles of doubts and fears. Yes, this is a good idea. Wait, how does it affect me? And then how funds would be distributed, especially for some of those smaller organizations that thought perhaps their proposed activities wouldn't rank very high in the collaborative list, the partnership's priorities. Also, smaller organizations don't have the capacity to invest more time in fundraising beyond what they already do. Some of these organizations said they were 95% or 100% grant funded. And so what extra time do they have to invest in new fundraising strategies? And typically they were focused on the same kind of grant opportunities that they've always used. So then moving on to the findings relative to the Focused Investment Partnership Program. How can the program support these partnerships? Overall reflections on the FIP program. So far, this grant has worked very well. I think the secret to this success is flexibility at OWEB. Had OWEB led these grants with hard and fast prescriptions, I think success would be much lower. So across the board, people said, you're funding exactly what needs to be funded. It's flexible, it meets our needs. Courtney's great to work with. In working with each partnership and seeing where they are and what needs to be adjusted. So the funding went towards facilitators, whether internal or external facilitators, consultants such as GIS or communications consultants, and that staff capacity to participate primarily. But ironically, grantees did not get an implementation FIP. They got a capacity building FIP, but they were more influenced by the guidelines with the implementation FIP because of that strong desire to find that implementation funding to keep their partnership going. So even though there are other implementation, funding opportunities out there, most of them were very keenly focused on how can I increase my chances to get an implementation FIP grant. And so ironically, they were more influenced by the guidelines of that program. And especially with concerns about the linkage between the implementation FIP grants and the open solicitation grants. And of course, we all know there's more than one way to be strategic, but oftentimes when you think about what's most strategic, all of a sudden you have your favorite way and you think you are there is only one answer. But reflecting on these two restoration funding programs, as I said, that a lot of people, focused on and talked about the contrast or the complementarity. The Focused Investment Partnership Program is really designed to make those focused investments to have that real visible impact within a short period of time, to move that needle. And that can increase the kind of visibility and the buy-in from other stakeholders when they see the power of that restoration dollars. So it can really help mobilize effort and support for restoration. But the open solicitation program is designed to more flexibly respond to opportunities as they come up. And it distributes funding throughout the state, which is often a goal for public funding programs. But there was, as I said, a lot of concern and confusion around how these two programs were linked. If, their partnership was successful and got one of those competitive implementation FIP grants, would that mean then that the partners are not eligible to apply for the open solicitation grants? And so there was a lot of speculation among the grantees, and really recommended that more discussion is needed to figure out how to best link these programs or not, and to provide clear guidance and messaging to minimize confusion and speculation among potential grantees. And I will say that those partners that went to OWEB with their questions directly, they felt reassured and they did understand the connection between the programs. But if not all the partners heard that information, again, they'd bring it up in the meetings, and because of this concern about how we're going to get implementation funding, it did take quite a bit of time in the meetings to kind of wrestle with that. More than one way to be strategic. Similarly with the restoration approaches that the partnerships talked about, of course, there are more than two, but the two that really were in tension in a lot of different partnerships was one approach to aim for the biggest environmental win by identifying priority geographies and activities, usually using a very strictly kind of ecological focus, and then identifying willing landowners to make it happen, versus a restoration through relationships approach that starts with more modest environmental wins, but then over time you turn those skeptics into champions who then help their neighbors see it in a different way, and in some cases ending up with a string of landowners along an important stream reach that you can really have quite an impressive landscape scale restoration. And so obviously these two can both be strategic, but partners really said that those tensions played out in these partnerships. The biggest environmental win tended to align with the FIP grant opportunity in people's minds, and so the concern was that these partnerships would be moved towards that, to just focus on the biggest environmental win, and that if that open solicitation grant opportunity was closed off to some of those smaller partners, that perhaps they wouldn't be able to continue to address that restoration through relationships approach. And so the recommendation was really to provide more support to help partners respectfully discuss these different approaches and develop prioritization frameworks that integrated and allowed for this diversity of approaches. That both are important, obviously. And overall reflections on the FIP program. FIP or no FIP, we're going to use our plan to leverage more money. The leverage is the plan, the better the leverage. So at first when I asked people, how do you like the FIP program, it was early in their process, and a lot of people said 100%, we love the capacity building grant program. I don't think there's anything you could do to improve it. But then as they started reflecting on, well, maybe there are just a few little tweaks here and there, what kind of came out were that there really could be 4 phases of support. There could be more attention on the startup phase, that relationship building, organizational development that in a lot of people's experience took kind of 1 to 3 years before even launching into the technical planning. And then the planning phase, which very much looks like the current capacity building grant, the opportunity, the parts that focuses on. But then there could be another phase in there, pre-implementation phase, focused on the business planning, so that idea of helping groups diversify their fundraising strategies and match up those fundraising opportunities with the work that the partnership wants to do. A little bit of technical assistance support to better build out that list of prioritized projects. So by the end of the strategic action plan that the groups develop through their capacity building grant, often it's a pretty rough sketch of projects. And some people said with a little bit more funding, we could build out that project list and package those projects for specific funders. And then perhaps launch some of those fundraising and outreach activities so that they were solidly positioned to launch into implementation. And I anticipate getting more feedback on the implementation FIP as I reach out to the implementation phase, as I reach out to those implementation FIPs this fall. So look for more on that last phase on the next part of this report. And then suggested future investments in communications and outreach. So a lot of people said the strategic action planning process is technically rigorous, but it's not really built to then communicate and connect with the public around what matters to them. And so partners suggested studies on the economic value of restoration, and I know OWEB has done some of those studies, but the partners perhaps are not aware of that. And then a clear messaging to launch a statewide campaign that partners could then connect to and use in their local areas. And then also increased relationship building, particularly with local leaders and influencers who have a history of skepticism toward government, who have misunderstandings about restoration will take over their land, or that watershed councils are government entities. And some of the partners talked about some of the strategies they were using in their watersheds with their different partners that really were turning those skeptics into maybe not champions yet, but at least opening their minds and really tampering down some of the rhetoric about the negativity towards restoration. And that because they're influencers in their community, it really does shift the tone and conversation and the willingness of partners. So with that, I just wanted to really echo that the partners really over and over again appreciated the opportunity to give feedback to you all, and I think the confidential feedback really helped people be real forthcoming. And they did really appreciate the opportunity to learn from the different partnerships and look for other opportunities and ways that they can learn just among their peers, as well as they were all curious. This was very early in getting their capacity building grant that I reached out to some of them, and they said, hey, it would be great if OWEB would reach out to us maybe a year or two from now and kind of see where we've gone and see if we have more detailed feedback. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thanks for staying over, and this is really one of the most impressive documents I can remember seeing in my tenure here. Questions for Jennifer from the board?
So can I just start with one comment, because I want to make sure you guys have a chance to discuss this piece. So we will go into questions. I just want to jump back to the four-phase slide real quick, so that as you're thinking and having your discussion, what I mentioned at the beginning about the fiscal planning piece is that pre-implementation phase. Because we have a little bit of extra money, what we learned from this is we will often say, why are you just focused on the FIP? And we'll say it, we have a few FIP capacity folks sitting in the back of the room, and we will say it on our conference calls, right? FIP is not the thing you should be focused on. What we realized is we at the state level know all of those funding sources. So I can say, why aren't you talking to NRCS? Why aren't you talking to coastal wetlands? Why aren't you talking to NOAA? Why aren't, here's the list. And at the local level, they're saying, well, we don't even know those. We know you. And so that piece, if we can invest just a small amount of money, bringing them somebody with expertise about this kind of work, and there are many retired folks from the state and federal agencies and local nonprofits who know this stuff well, that we could boost these guys to a place where that FIP conversation isn't the thing where they're saying, wait, there's 8 of us and you're only going to fund 2, and my partnership's going to fall apart. So that's why we think if we can just put a small amount of money in that piece, we can test that and see if that's something that the board wants to do more of down the road. So with that, any questions that you have for Jennifer about anything, but I just wanted to call out that.
Well.
One thing I'm curious about from my personal experience with a group is the tension, at least that we experience, between the strategic planning and the governance stuff, in that you could only go, at least in our case, you could only go so far with talking about how we ought to work together without having some meat to chew on. And so without having some work on what it is we're going to do, it was hard to know how it is we should make decisions. And yet, ultimately, you couldn't make decisions about the strategic plan without having some better sense of how you were going to make those decisions. So I wonder if any of that came out in your discussion, or if you had any.
Definitely,
thoughts.
it did come out in the partnerships and in other partnerships I've worked with. So it's kind of a chicken or an egg, and it's hard to have those abstract conversations at first about how partners will work together if you don't know what kinds of decisions you're going to be making together. So in my experience, it works well if you first start talking about at least partner roles and kind of some general ideas of how you're going to make decisions together, and then you get into the work, and then you touch back on, so it's like an iterative process. And it doesn't, and maybe some groups are ready, excuse me, to dive into, just some allergies, are ready to dive into the technical work. And so that's okay too, if that feels right for the group, but don't go too far into the technical planning without revisiting partner roles and priorities. Because what often happens is partners, if they don't feel like their role is clearly understood, and then all of a sudden something comes up in the technical planning they don't agree with, they're confused about how to raise their concerns, and then they start getting kind of disgruntled or internalizing that. It's very common.
Any other, yes, Carl.
A lot of what you talked about had to do with capacity, and OWEB funds capacity for the councils, and I presume in all of these, the councils had big leadership roles in making all this work. Was that your finding? Did you see, is there much tension between the different groups trying to build these partnerships based on the fact that the councils get some capacity funding, but the other groups generally don't, and have to get, many of them are dependent on projects to get their capacity? Did you find that to be a problem in the dynamic?
It wasn't exactly a tension, but people did kind of reference it. So, and one of the tensions or aspects of some of the partnerships I didn't mention were the number of watershed councils or soil and water conservation districts, and if there tended to be multiples, usually there was one that had much higher capacity and more staff, and then there would be others that were much smaller, and there were some tensions there, but I think the partnerships managed it quite well, but it was a reality. I wouldn't say there was any hard feelings about people not having that capacity fund, that the watershed councils do. I would say at least one of the tribes I talked to, and I talked to a number of tribal representatives, did say that often there was the assumption that the tribes had capacity because they had staff in the offices, but the breadth of issues that they would work with, anything from cultural camps for kids to, salmon restoration projects, and then the vast geographies, that even though they had a few staff people, that they were stretched really thin and they didn't necessarily have the technical training to participate fully in implementation the way they would like to. And so with a little bit more capacity funding for some of those tribes that didn't have those other funding sources, that they could more fully participate, and they were very specific about participating and more fully commenting on the planning documents, participating in joint fundraising if they had a little more capacity, and getting that technical training for implementation. But overall, I didn't feel like there were hard feelings about some groups had that capacity funding and some didn't. Some of the groups were quite high functioning and didn't kind of rely on that or need that capacity funding. But the smaller organizations definitely did.
Did you, in looking at this, did you find that the councils that we do fund their capacity, were they very key in making this move forward? And was that an important piece? I mean,
Definitely.
The councils, did they take a leadership role in all of this?
Definitely they did. And I would say particularly some of those watershed councils that do have more capacity and more staff, that had the capacity to do that internal strategic planning previously, and they were pretty strategic as an organization, they could play a leadership role in bringing other partners together. For some of the smaller watershed councils that just kind of had capacity to participate as much as they could, but they still felt kind of pulled in lots of different directions. So maybe they would attend meetings and try to, review documents as much as they could, but they didn't have the time to fully, dive into all the details and comment on all the details if they didn't have that full capacity. And one of the things I will mention too is, what was I going to say? Often, and not just with these partnerships, but I did hear it come out very strongly, is at the beginning of a collaborative project, you don't really know how much time it's going to take. And that's part of that value proposition. And so you participate saying, like, let's see where this goes. Often these take a lot more time than people expect. Kind of like the decision you all made yesterday on that funding that watershed council. It could be straightforward, or you never know what issue the group will really need to wrestle with and spend a lot of time on. So as a small organization, if you spend a lot of time, if the group spends a lot of time on certain issues, you may not have time to continue to participate at the same level that you would like to. So I think there's a trade-off there too.
I'm going somewhere with this, so there's something for the board to be thinking about, and clearly we've talked about capacity this whole meeting, and in these the FIPs as well as everywhere else, that the councils that get the funding for our capacity are very important. And we also heard throughout the whole weekend how devastating turnover can be, and we saw many examples of that, including out at the dam and 4 different leaders. And so in this, I would assume that in this process, if you had turnover in an FIP in the building process or even into it, that's going to be very disruptive. And so we as a board just need to be thinking about ways to ameliorate that turnover that is out there. And I just thought I'd bring that up.
And I just Meta has something, but I just have one more follow-up, because you're right. And a lot of the watershed coordinators, especially the smaller organizations where it's a one-staff shop, I talked to a few of them, and they actually said when the partnership's working, it's such a great source of ideas, professional camaraderie, that it can feel very isolating being in that watershed council as the only staff person, and it can actually feel real uplifting to be part of this larger partnership, even if it's more like an information network than a fully collaborative partnership. That adds real near-term value for some of those smaller councils, and that the partnership themselves really values those smaller watershed councils and the perspective they bring. And some of the other partners even said, you should talk to this watershed council and this one. Even though they're smaller, they're going to have some really interesting things to say and contribute, because they have in our meetings. So.
Thank you.
Maida and Dan.
So I want to add just a little nuance to what Carl was asking, because I like the path that you're going down. The interesting thing is, going through the list in my head of who is in those groups, whether they were a big council or a small council, all of them were getting our funding. And it's a little bit how, I think there's a really interesting analysis for us to do, because the small ones she talks about that don't have a lot of capacity, we're still getting capacity funding from us. Mm-hmm. And so what is it that makes those ones tick that are able to step up and take that leadership role, and how can we help more of them do that? Because even with the base capacity funding, you still get very differing levels of capacity within those councils. So I think there's a lot there to dig into.
Dan?
Yeah, Dan Thorndike. First of all, so many of these observations, resonate so with me, both with lots of work with other nonprofits and stuff, but from an OWEB perspective, like forever, pretty much from, pre-SIP, the SIP open solicitation. It's so applicable to I think almost everything we've done in a granting way, and a lot of the way that our grantees function. But in more specific, I wanted to circle back to Maida's tie-in on that pre-implementation phase stuff, just to clarify that a little bit as to how we define that that particular phase and how we would best encourage, a good development of that pre-implementation phase, because I'm just, that thing between funding, obviously sometimes your partners from the beginning are there because they're funding partners versus direct, or maybe a higher element of funding than on the ground stuff. And this one, this pre-implementation phase seems to suggest you already have your key partners, and we're talking about then all of those partners having a strategy to leverage and fundraise. And just to kind of clarify that a bit as to where do we add a little.
So for the record, Maida Lofsgarden, which I keep forgetting we need to say, what we are talking about here is just testing one piece with folks who already have FIPS. So we are capacity building. So we are not saying we're going to do an offering and say, hey, come, all comers, if you want to launch your fundraising, your business planning approach. We are talking about just with the ones, the 8 that already exist, trying out this thing of, can we give you some extra expertise? Because often many of them don't have the funders at the table. They are the implementer, so they are amazing at the plan. They know what needs to be done in their community, but when you say, where are you going to go for funding? They say, we're going to go to an implementation FIP, because they don't know what other funding is out there. So they might have a local Forest Service person there, but that's not necessarily the person who knows what a Two Chiefs initiative could look like, for example. So, so it is just with those 8, testing for you all, if we give them that extra piece, and think about somebody like a Ken Beerley, who Ken knows every nook and cranny and every hidey hole for money. I'm scared because he knows where my wallet is, right? That's the kind of people that could really help these guys get to that phase where they're not just saying, my only path is an implementation FIP, and if I don't get it, this partnership's going to fall apart. So that's the piece we want to test. We don't think all 8 of them need it. Some of them are doing this really well. But if we could just infuse a little bit of funding with them there, we would then come back to you next time around and say, hey, we think this is really good and we should add it to the offering, or we think we should do a separate offering, but we don't know till we test it.
Right, but thinking of that kind of assistance, that's a very specialized niche. I mean, I think it's important to develop, because if you just read that as saying, well, I mean, the classic scene out there, we're going to solve all of our problems by hiring a part-time development director.
Right.
And that rarely, I mean,
Yes.
it doesn't
That
work
is
very
not
much.
what this is.
This is something someone who really knows.
This world.
Yeah, we almost would create that.
And not a very expensive contract. This is, and again, we know of a lot of folks out there who have this expertise, who are retired from a
I'm
lot
sure
of
would be
these.
happy to, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, great, thanks.
Yeah.
So, Will, and then Alan, and Randy, and then Rosemary.
So 2 things. I think both of them are actually more for the board and staff than for you, but I really appreciated the description of the centralized resources issue, in particular GIS and IT. I think you also mentioned somewhat analogously, we just talked about the diversified funding, assistance, and communication tools as things which are hard for every organization to have expertise in all those things and to have it available. And so for us, thinking about ways in which, and I think it's beyond FIPS, it's also for every other organization we work with, can use assistance in some of these areas. So I think it would be a great exercise for us to spend some time on a couple of these and figure out, they wouldn't all be delivered the same way, but they all are consistent issues for watershed councils and so forth around the state, not just within the FIP program. And it's not necessarily that OWEB needs to become a GIS delivery service. I think there are other models that could be used. The second one is looking at the findings on page 11, readiness to shift towards collaborative restoration, a history of strong relationships, leadership, internal strategic planning, and some other things. It's been sufficiently long since we set out our criteria for choosing, for selecting among the members for FIPS who have applied. This seems like a great list to go back and see, are we getting at these things in our criteria when we're ranking the applications that come in? If you haven't already. Page 1112. The findings of readiness to shift towards collaborative restoration. Because one of our big questions is, are they, well-functioning partnership or not? And this is a group of ways of asking at that, getting at some of those questions. So that led to a different question, which is we're entering rulemaking and we're entering our FIP 2.0 cycle in a year. And I'm wondering a little bit in terms of findings from the implementation side, which will start in October and not finish till 2018, when we're actually asking for people whether, are we going to get findings back from the 1.0 in a timely way that we can incorporate them if we need to. If we can't, we can't too, but in particular with rulemaking, it would be nice to not have that, if it would affect rulemaking, have it not arrive so after we've already approved the rulemaking. Now that we've already approved the schedule, but those were just 2 comments.
I can say a word about the timing of reaching out to the IFIPs. So we didn't want to start in the spring with them because they had their hands full, launching their implementation FIP work. But now in the fall, when things will slow down, so I'm going to start reaching out to them in September. And I really tried to work with the partnerships. So if they had a lot going on, or they said, well, maybe next month would be better. So that's why I could do the work more efficiently, but it's because of the time, we're trying to meet the timing needs of the partnership. So it's possible that it could go sooner and be completed earlier, so we can coordinate that as well.
My guess is the rulemaking is at a high enough level it wouldn't impact it, but the launch of 2.0 might.
Yeah, though it would implicate what we are evaluating them on. And so I think if there is more refined in this, I think that actually would be really helpful in the what do we mean when we talk about the partnership capacity piece. So I think we can coordinate on that.
Alan?
Alan Henning. Thank you for your presentation. It was rich with a lot of information that you've identified. I think one of the concerning parts that you brought up was the fact that the capacity building, the FIP capacity building partnerships are really focused on FIP implementation grants. And what happens when 6 of them don't make it? And how are they going to continue? Are they going to do, have we set the stage for them to fail because they've targeted the FIP implementation process so much that they haven't begun to look at other things? And I think it leads to the pre-implementation phase that Maida, you were talking about, the value of maybe funding them on their business plan. So that business plan looks not just at the FIP implementation benefits, but it looks at broader benefits as a collaborative, as a partnership. I think that's really important for us to look at now and maybe even down the future, is that instead of calling a FIP capacity building grant, look at it just as a capacity building grant that targets FIPs or targets other activities, targets building a solid group business plan so that they're ready if in fact the FIP process doesn't come their way, they're ready to do a business plan that easily links into the other funding opportunities so that they become more of a stable group rather than one that just put all their eggs in one basket.
Rosemary?
Rosemary Furphy, thank you very much. Excellent presentation. I was intrigued by it seemed like there were themes of consistent needs for many of the groups, particularly the IT and GIS support, and building on what Maida's saying about looking for fundraising sources. So it seems that that kind of information would benefit not only the groups you worked with, but others. And I'm wondering to what capacity OWEB can or does provide that kind of information. I'm thinking even the governance documents where you're not reinventing the wheel or spending time seeking out that kind of information, if we may have templates available and information that they can then build upon. So I don't know to what extent OWEB provides that already, or something we can look to for the future, not only for these groups, but even others.
So this is Maida. I can speak to that. One of the things that Courtney has done a tremendous job of since I think day one is set up a system that they can all share with each other. And so there is, for governance documents, for the RFPs, for facilitators, for all of that is a common shared space for these folks that is available. And quickly can be turned on for other folks to use, opened up for other folks to use as well. I think there's a challenge and an opportunity. We've talked about this a little bit with Connect in the past, around the funder piece, right? Making that information available. And the challenge is the funding that's available is so specific to the thing. So funding that's available for estuaries, for example, is very different than the funding that the Clackamas Watershed Council might need for the work that they're doing. And so some of it's general. There was a group that put together a book about 5 or 6 years ago that was this thick, and didn't quite fill the need of, you know, what I don't know if this funding works for me or not. So I think that actually is us training people on how to think about funding. Because the funding sources, it's incredibly difficult to say that one funding source works for everybody. We don't know if there's a CIS, for example, in an area. They can't just go get equip money. So it's really kind of teaching people about that philosophy and that approach. And again, I think bringing in some experts to help them learn. Because the funding sources can be very different based on what they're trying to accomplish. But I think we can play a good role in it.
Can I respond? I had just a quick response to Rosemary's kind of specific thing. I mean, I love this stuff about having, you know, potentially funding some method of like GIS. I mean, it would probably be something like a grant to Oregon State, and then people who are grantees get a deal. I mean, we're not going to be doing that. But the governance thing worries me. It doesn't worry me. I mean, I think it's important, but you have to be careful, because I've seen too many instances of where you have like a quote-unquote centralized source and people are stealing everybody else's, you know, bylaws and stuff, and they're just crummy bylaws or something, and that starts just replicating, and that goes back to your right-sizing the governance thing, because, I mean, it's just, it happens all the time. People think they're going to really address all of these potential problems in their governance documents and get very, very specific. Then nobody looks at them again until there's a problem, and then, you know, the vultures circle and they start plucking out all these things that nobody's been doing for 3 years, and it just blows up. So, I mean, you have to be, just a little caution on not assuming that's always super easy, or you really want to look at it and make sure you're not creating kind of these traps that are out there. But just some nasty past experience.
And I would just echo that support and sharing. Some of the partnerships, one of them had like the most amazing partnership manual that I've seen. I was really impressed. But I was impressed because you could tell they really had those in-depth conversations, and they really came to their own ideas. There were some decisions where I was like, I wonder why they decided that. And when I went to the meeting and chatted with people, like they had actually wrestled with it and decided on that. And that's really the key to success, that it's right for the group. And too often, especially if the funder provides a template, people are going to use that because they think that's what the funder wants, and they want to please you all, so they'll have more chances of funding in the future. It's a common trap, because the funder kind of sees where the needs are and where they can provide support, but if it's not the right support, people will kind of make it fit because they trust you and they want to work with you. But I think sharing some things that are working with people and providing some examples and then encouraging groups to modify, I think works well.
Okay. This is Randy Labby. Jennifer, two quick questions. I'm wondering if you're, in your second phase, going to be considering some recommendations to OWEB about the potential for using your document as a device to educate partnerships at the outset, and how best to do that. And secondly, this is really blue sky. We're going to be, I think, meeting with Surfboard next year, potentially. I'd really be interested in our board being briefed on, the strengths of our model in Oregon and the strengths and weaknesses of your model in Washington.
Mm-hmm. She doesn't have the Surfboard.
No, but she's just from her experience of working in Washington. So that this board can make some, kind of long-range judgments as to our direction and validating the consolidation strategy that we've had, and so forth. So that's just, Will, did we have to wrap
No,
up here?
yeah, that was.
Okay. Well, thank you very much,
Thank you,
Jennifer.
Jeff.
That was very valuable.
Thank you for the opportunity to present with you all. It's a
Appreciate
treat,
you
a
staying
real treat.
over.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to do this?
So this is Maida. We are now moving to the stakeholder engagement agenda item, and then we'll return to the FIP implementation agenda item.
But we also have a public comment period here.
We didn't have any.
We didn't, okay. Do you want to do this one?
Sure. There's not that there's anything to do, so.
Let me just make sure. Derica, we didn't have general public comment, right? It's specific to. Okay.
So before we start, I guess I'll remind people we have a public comment opportunity for outreach, stakeholder engagement, and if you've got any, bring the yellow slip up to Derica, and that'll be after this introduction. Go ahead.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Eric Williams, Grant Program Manager at OWEB. This is Agenda Item K in your binders, Outreach Stakeholder Engagement Administrative Rules. I'll give a brief introduction about what we're covering today, then we'll have the public comment period and then reconvene for further discussion. A little bit of history on the effort, and I think you've probably heard a little bit of this before, so I'll be fairly brief. What initiated this effort really was passage of Measure 76 in 2010, which incorporated significant changes to our constitutional and then flowing from that statutory language in terms of our authorities for our different programs, one of which is the Outreach Grant Program. Under our initial constitutional language, Measure 66, there was pretty broad language around what we could do for outreach grant making in terms of broad educational programs, professional development, many things that are very broad and general in nature in terms of improving understanding around watershed issues. The language in Measure 76 around outreach grant authority was changed substantially to remove that broad authority for education and really focus it on outreach that was, quote, necessary for carrying out eligible restoration and acquisition projects. And so the board at the time had a number of things to do after Measure 76 passed, was aware of this issue and prioritized for staff and the board to tackle it during the 15 to 17 biennium, which just ended, so we almost made that deadline. We're pretty close. But I think that did create some confusion among some of the stakeholders that we communicated with around this as to why are we doing this now, where this seems to have come out of the blue. Well, that's the history of it, and we did a lot of things in between passage of 66 and 76 to revamp our programs, and this was the timing with which the board had designated to address this one. So to begin our work, we convened a work group made up of folks that are experienced with outreach grants from OWEB in all 6 of our regions, as well as the Coalition of Oregon Land Trust and the Network of Oregon Watershed Councils. And that work group list is included in your packet and included members from watershed councils and soil and water conservation districts. We worked with them to really focus on how we can better solicit for outreach projects that meet our statutory criteria. We had a lot of discussions in the work group about what that means. What does it mean in terms of geography? What does it mean in terms of timeline of outreach projects? What does it mean in terms of the types of audiences that we're engaging with? And I think the product of that was a really well-designed application, draft application, which we hope to use to solicit for outreach projects in our fall solicitation. While that was going on in this past January, you'll recall the board designated that work group as a rulemaking advisory committee so that we can use the experience that they had in hashing through these issues to develop a set of rules that made sense in terms of our current statutory language. Then as part of the process, we had a public comment period, which was during the month of June, scheduled 2 public hearings, but did not get attendance at those. One was in Sisters and one was in Eugene. We did, however, get a number of public comments. which are summarized in the table that's provided in attachment B to the staff report. Many of the comments that you'll see in there reference the desire to continue funding education programs that are broad in nature, that are considered by the commenters to be important to continue improving an understanding of the benefits of watershed restoration enhancements so that eligible projects can be carried out. And you'll notice in the far right column, we designated whether or not we incorporated those particular comments into a revised draft of the rules that was sent out for public comment. Many of those we did not because we felt that what the commenters were asking us to do would not match with our statutory authority around outreach grants. There were, however, a few comments that we felt could be incorporated into the draft set of rules. Those are designated with a yes in that far right-hand column, and also shown in red text in attachment C, which is the draft of the stakeholder engagement grant rules that were sent out with public comment, with our responses included in strikeout and underline in red. And so those changes that were incorporated are fairly easy to spot in this draft, and I can summarize those very briefly. One of which came from a comment from Bruce Taylor, who also was one of the crafters of the language in Measure 76 itself. And so obviously that's going right to the source of what does this language mean that's in Measure 76. And his comment was around making sure that we're not being too narrow in our interpretation of necessary for carrying out eligible restoration acquisition projects. His comment was around doing the kind of outreach that might be necessary to implement programmatically efforts that will result in eligible projects and programs. And so we incorporated language to that effect in the revised draft that's in front of you in attachment C. And you'll notice right up front in the purpose statement, for example, the phrase added after necessary for carrying out eligible restoration or acquisition projects, we added comma or programs that lead to development of eligible projects. So it sounds like that's a nuanced change, but I do think it's fairly significant in helping people understand that we do not have to have a specific project targeted to be able to fund a stakeholder engagement outreach project around it. We can fund a stakeholder engagement project that addresses programmatically in a specific geography and with a specific timeline in mind, but not necessarily specific project sites already developed. As the final note that I'll make in terms of introduction to this material is in the handout version of that same attachment that Eric just passed out to you. We recently got feedback from the Department of Justice on this draft set of rules and wanted to make sure that we had a chance to incorporate her recommendations into this package. And so what was passed out in front of you has changes that she recommended highlighted in yellow. And I'll walk through those very briefly. There's not a lot of them. In the first paragraph, which is the purpose statement, she wanted us to insert the word outreach in the very first sentence so that it reads, the board shall provide outreach grants, rather than just the board shall provide grants. And then at the end of that sentence, added the constitutional reference in addition to the statutory reference. And her reason for that was to make clear that this set of rules is amplifying the language in Constitution and statute that says we're authorized to provide outreach grants. And so that is where that term lies. We discussed this a little bit yesterday when we were going over the spending plan. This is the detail of what our attorney recommended. On the second page, the first two yellow changes on the second line are just simply clarifying references to sections of the Constitution and to the Oregon revised statutes. The next change on that page is a word construction change in that first numbered paragraph, just breaking up what was a colon with the list of A, B, C, D below to add a new sentence that says eligible project types include prior to the A, B, C, D under number 1. And then on the third page, there's 2 simple changes, just adding the letters OAR in front of the rule number references, which is Oregon Administrative Rules. And those are the changes recommended by the Attorney General. And so I'm happy to answer questions if you prefer, or we can head into the public comments. Oh, and I will reference that you did also receive written comments in your blue folders that are in the orange packet.
Carl?
One of the issues in terms of who can, or what kind of projects are eligible would depend on the definition of stakeholder. Are elementary kids stakeholders?
Stakeholders can include anyone in Oregon. In the context of stakeholder engagement for outreach grants, the engagement that you conduct with the stakeholders has to be aligned to implement eligible projects or programs that implement eligible projects. And so one example I can think of where students were incorporated into a project that would appear to be eligible under this new set of rules is in the McKenzie Watershed, where they sometimes incorporate students in riparian revegetation projects where they've got professional, technically designed restoration projects occurring in riparian areas. They sometimes break off pieces of that don't require a lot of skill to implement, such as certain planting portions in the riparian area. And from their perspective, it accomplishes 2 things. It does the kind of work they want to do with youth and students, but it also helps them accomplish restoration projects more cost effectively by breaking off pieces where they would otherwise be hiring labor crews that cost a lot more than bringing in high school students or something of that nature.
Maida?
Sorry to ask for clarification on that one, Eric, but wouldn't we have funded that one under the restoration program? It would have been a restoration grant?
It certainly could have been funded under a restoration grant, but they've been funding that work under the outreach program, and I believe that's still
in this
eligible.
Okay. I would give maybe another example more tied to the engagement piece where you might be doing a dam removal project and you are talking to the community at a school about this dam removal project that's coming up and why we're doing it, where we're doing it, that you need to engage the community because it could blow up in your face, but it's about a project and it's got community engagement. So he is right that community engagement can be broad, but it has to be, like in Eric's example about the McKinsey, or when you're talking about a project that you need to do, it's got to be tied back to a project or a program that leads to development of eligible projects. So that's the key piece, is that it's not a broad education program.
Dan?
Yeah, Dan Thorndike. I just reread the statute, the 541-956, and it really, if you just take out all the words that we're not paying attention to right now, money shall be used for the following activities, ... outreach activities necessary for carrying out subsections 1 to 3, which are all the other stuff. We don't have the word stakeholder. We don't have the word engagement, any of that stuff. I'm just get a little worried about, okay, we say, well, stakeholders, everybody. What if somebody says, well, no, stakeholder means, some dragging something up. I don't know why we just don't call them outreach activities, period. And I mean,
Isn't that in the definition of stakeholder engagement?
Right. Well,
project?
It says kind of, but I mean, I'm just. Why do we need to create this new term that doesn't exist in statute or in the Constitution? It just. I don't. If you just stick right with, we want to comply with the statute, which is implementing the constitutional provision, just say outreach activity, all the rest of the functional stuff's still going to be pretty much has to tie to a specific, and I mean, the operational language is that it has to support one of those other 1, 2, 3, which is, you know, acquisition, restoration, protection, water stuff. You know, it ties to that whole range of stuff. I'm just hate to see creating a new kind of term of art that's not really specifically defined.
I think your open solicitation committee might speak to that because they had a lot of discussions in that area.
I think this is Bob Weber. Our discussions kind of revolved around the idea that outreach was a concept that had existed, and because of Measure 76, the statute, if we just use the same term into the future, they would think it was the same thing. And we were trying to make a shift so that they understood it wasn't business as usual, the old, same old, same old.
What is the old same old?
Well, that outreach was they could do school programs that just had no relationship
This is
to
Dan again,
projects.
But in the history of that time, there was a pretty clear distinction between education and outreach, and that was one of the underlying dilemmas at the whole time was when you had $500,000 for both in your budget, and you're trying to say, and you had folks who were actually advocating for education, going into the classrooms, little kids dressed like Sam, and the whole thing that we all saw, and then the other part being outreach specifically, usually landowner recruitment, stuff like that, which is clearly, so I wouldn't say that, I think we still do the same old on what we used to call outreach. That's still allowed.
That goes away.
But
That program goes away.
what program?
So what Bob is saying is, from 2012 to 2017, we've been funding the same old outreach and education.
Right.
Under what is called outreach, and what they were trying to do is make a clean break.
Oh.
To say that, instead of having people trying to come back in and apply to that, to make a very clear break.
That's kind of an internal,
It's not so much internal because it's our external folks who are applying. So the Open Solicitation Committee did have a very long conversation that got the RAC to this point of, we want to be really clear, this is not same old, same old. So that, you're right that the term is not in statute, but that was the reasoning behind
right.
what we heard from the committee.
But I'm just trying to suggest that, again, before, there was sort of an internal distinction that was pretty bright between education and outreach.
But between 2012 and 17, there was not.
Okay.
We were funding both under one. We continued to fund education under this outreach category.
So we'll have a board deliberation after public comment. If there are any questions for these guys before we go. Bob?
Bob Weber, I was, when I was going over the OARs, the proposed OARs are 695-015-XXXX. And I don't know what XXXX means. And then in the latter, there are references in there to 695-015-0050, 0060. And I don't know if we're referring back to these OARs or there's some other OARs that have those numbers somewhere else.
Eric Williams, OWEB Grant Program Manager. The reason that the XXXs are in there for the new set of rules is that Eric will be working with the state offices that control these things to determine what those numbers should be. The references that are in there to existing full numbered OARs, such as 695, 010, 0040, those are referring to our existing restoration rules that are already on the books. 695-010 are our restoration rules, and then sections 0040 and 0050 are subsections of our existing restoration rules.
So I think there's a typo then on page 3. It says 2 at the technical review team meeting. The team shall review blah 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 OAR 695015, which is these rules 0050.
Yep.
That would appear to be 010-0050, be my guess, based on what is later in this project, in this. Because 695015 is these.
Yes, that's
And
correct.
so-
That should be.
So it can't be 050 because we don't
right.
even have
It should
50.
be 010. That's a good catch.
I guess I don't know why we don't have the numbers in here.
They're assigned by the Secretary of State's office, so we don't assign them, those last four numbers. They do that when we turn in the final rule to them.
Okay, well, when we, ODFW is doing it, we always know what the numbers are. And I just was curious, that's, okay.
Okay,
Actually, I might be able to speak to that, Bob. I think the reason is often you guys are amending existing rule. We are doing a full cut and replace. And so it's not the existing numbers that we're changing. And we've done this twice before. We did it with acquisitions and one other where we did basically a full gut and stuff. And in that case, worked with Secretary, which is very different than when we're amending and replacing an existing rule.
Okay, then the other thing is in, I guess it's 695015XXX on the bottom of page, well, about halfway down page 1, when we're talking about the eligibility under 1B, it says will lead to eligible restoration or acquisition projects within a specific time frame. Lead isn't, I don't know what that means. And time frame, I don't know what, I mean, I know what a time frame is, but there is no time frame. And so it's wide open, and I don't know that that would really comply with the statute and the Constitution.
Eric Williams, OWEB staff. The language in there that will lead to eligible restoration or acquisition projects is intended to be plainly read, that the outreach or the stakeholder engagement activity is designed in a progression of time to help build support that will lead to the ability to implement an eligible project. The time frame, the reason the language there says a specific time frame is intended to address the issue that the stakeholder engagement really isn't, based on the constitutional language and the statutory language, intended to be kind of multi-generational. In other words, we're going to do some stakeholder engagement with kids so that 30 years from now they might become people who implement projects. And so the specific time frame is designed to be listed in the application so that when it's evaluated, the review teams can make that judgment as to whether or not this is meeting the intent of the constitutional statutory language.
That totally occurred to me as I'm reading that, and so you could say.
Carl Winter speaking.
Sorry, Carl Winter. Okay, we're going to do an educational program, so in 30 years, we're going to restore this watershed.
Right.
And does that still fit?
No, Eric Williams, no, it wouldn't. It is intended that the evaluation criteria would look at that, the review team would look at that based on the evaluation criteria and say that does not meet the intent of these rules in the statute.
Because it's not a specific restoration or acquisition project identified.
It is an and in that statement, not an or. A and B. So they would have to say, I'm doing an education program for 30 years from now to remove a very specific dam in a very specific place. So it would be incredibly hard for somebody to. Specific project. Yeah.
Dam removals take 20
Stephen?
years. We just found that out yesterday.
Yeah, I just wanted to,
Stephen, then we need to move to open.
just wanted to follow up what the committee discussion was related to Dan's question, and it really had to do with that outreach grants that are necessary for carrying out, restoration projects. And I think the argument was that there's a lot of outreach activities, elementary education, flyers, a variety of things that are extremely valuable, but are they necessary for doing outreach projects? And if the criteria is to make it more restrictive, then the concept of stakeholder engagement was one that involves outreach and is part of something that one could argue would be necessary for any kind of restoration activity, broadly defining stakeholders. And like Carl's thing, the 30-year question is, it gets on the edge. One could make the case maybe and try a proposal in that regard, but so it doesn't exclude that necessarily, but it is, but the criteria is more restrictive based on what we were interpreting Measure 76 to say.
Yeah, this is Dan. I mean, I'm okay with it. It's just, I think
Excellent.
this will not be the first time we have rules that have unnecessary language or circular definitions. So, I mean, might as well be consistent with the rest, so it's okay.
Okay, so I think we're ready to move to public comment on this topic. So we have two people, both from the Walla Walla Basin Watershed Council. Were you planning to come up together or separately? Separately? Okay. Graham Banks. And then Brian Walcott after that. And you have 5 minutes. Is that right?
And there's
As a
light in
reminder,
front of-
there's a green light that starts. It'll change to yellow when you have a minute left.
Okay, thank you. Yes, my name is Graham Banks, and thank you for having me. I'm here as a volunteer, and as I've been for all the time I've spent on this topic, but I am the part-time outreach coordinator for the Walla Walla Basin Watershed Council. I've been in the position for 5 years, and I'm here because I have to advocate for the type of outreach program the council has. I believe the program is making a difference in my community, and is an appropriate approach to further protection and restoration of fish and wildlife habitat and watershed and ecosystem function, as stated in the ORS 541956. I know you guys have all seen that, but I had to print off copies too, because I'll be referring to it a couple times. In my time in this position, I have crafted an outreach program to align with this legislation language. I was made aware of that was what we need to be following, and so we had done so. I have a 14-member board of diverse directors that are very supportive of our outreach program, who all approved a letter submitted in the June comment period by our council chair, John Zerba. I can't go very much of the letter, but it stated that the proposed rules of the stakeholder engagement grants pose a potential risk to the function of our outreach program. It also stated that through ongoing outreach with a strong educational component, we are cultivating a population of engaged stakeholders. And also that they stated that we ask that you continue to allow us to tailor our outreach in a way that will give us the best chance at meeting critical conservation restoration goals. The intent of the letter was to support our current program. So for clarification, our outreach program is a collection of components, including project tours, presentations and booths at public events, but also coordination of field days for students to learn from natural resource professionals applicable lessons in a setting typically where they can experience some of these learned concepts. So, for example, U.S. Forest Service discussing erosion or hydrology up in the upper watershed where they can, have a view of our valley below. Also, a Salmon in the Classroom project with a series of lessons that provides students a basis of understanding and perspective on the monumental restoration challenges we're facing and that they will likely inherit. The program also coordinates volunteer events to engage community in hands-on restoration activities such as riparian plantings, invasive species removals, river cleanups, and we also have an educational riparian restoration project on a stream on an elementary school property. So, plus of various other activities like newsletters. But so anyhow, these activities are to address the lack of understanding of natural systems and the extent of degradation. But this is not only true for the general population, but personally, I can't claim to fully understand our basin's hydrology and ecology. I believe that most of the scientific community would even agree with me, because there has been so much manipulation over such a long period of time that that it's not completely clear the context of restoration and acquisition necessary to restore these systems. Using beaver as an example, we have, been impacting the population for 200 years. We may not be ready to implement beaver restoration projects now, but doing outreach that will kind of prime our stakeholders, I think, is valuable. So the program's been going since 2003. I don't know exactly what was delivered, but I know that today that those people that are actually stakeholders. They're making water resources decisions, and I know that the information I'm providing today are going to better equip that Oregonians to make better equip Oregonians to address our restoration needs. And,
your time is.
It looks like I'm out of time.
Light is blinking there. Thank you. Any questions for Graham or Brian? Which one am I on here? Questions, comments, Dan?
Dan, it highlights the obvious issues we have of when blending that education and thing. Now, it also, the examples provide some kind of creative opportunities too. One thing is, we've seen other projects, actual restoration projects that are specifically cited in a location that is intended to educate. I won't even use that word. I'll use something else. Inform people about, right, whether it's been some urban ones, which makes sense because of that element, whether it's at a school site. We've had some at school sites which can do that. So that's one part. The other part is it may be just kind of wearing another hat as a funder on another foundation, and we do sometimes fund Watershed Council activities in this particular foundation for activities that OWEB can't fund. That might have to be the strategy there. And fortunately, I find you get outside of the OWEB world with a lot of funders, the best thing you can ask for is stuff about like education and kids and that kind of stuff. It's a very, it's an easy ask usually, especially if you trundle all the little kids wearing salmon costumes. That comes back from a meeting on the coast years ago, and it was so effective. It was like immediately everyone just bent over and started giving money. It was great. But that might have to be what's going to be happening, is a focus on. I don't think it's going to mean that watershed councils aren't going to be doing any of that kind of work. It's going to have to diversify the funding.
I'll just make two really quick notes. I think for the board, Dan is exactly right. Actually, what Graham described, probably a set of that is very much eligible under stakeholder engagement. We were talking about beaver restoration. We need to do some outreach and some stakeholder engagement about what that looks like. And a set of it wouldn't be, because it is strictly education. But doing a restoration project at a school is a restoration project that happens to be at a school. And so I think what Graham has done is raise this very interesting challenge that came up after the passage of Measure 76, when it separated those two concepts. And now we're left with this space where he's doing an integrated program that the Constitution doesn't allow us to fully fund, but allows us to fund part. I would just note on the other piece, Dan, the network of Oregon Watershed Councils has been doing a lot of work trying to find those other funding sources, and they are not actually as easy to come by as we thought they would be, because of the huge investment in outdoor school, that a lot of the attention got focused there. But I want to thank the network, who's been doing a yeoman's work trying to help solve that.
Randy?
This is Randy. Is there any potential to determine if the outdoor school, when they are fully funded, can provide some funds for us?
They cannot.
Oh.
But they certainly, there's conversations going on between, but no, that's a specific program.
All right, thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
Brian, you're up next. Brian Walcott, Walla Walla Basin Watershed Council.
Good morning, Board, Chairs. My name is Brian Walcott. I'm the Executive Director of the Walla Walla Basin Watershed Council, and I've been serving in that capacity for 20 years now. And over that time, we've completed over 25 fish passage projects, over 100 irrigation efficiency and stream flow improvement projects to get our river flowing again. And many of those projects have resulted from our outreach program. Today, I would like to speak in support of OWEB continuing to fund watershed education and outreach. I see in the OWEB strategic planning update staff report that occurred earlier this week that one of the 5 impacts that OWEB wants to achieve in Oregon is a broad care and stewardship of watersheds in Oregon. And to quote from that, that can come about only by greater understanding, awareness, and appreciation by each Oregonian of the impact of their everyday actions on the health of their watersheds. Working with partners, OWEB will make a special effort to meaningfully engage each Oregonian based on their unique connection with the land, whether cultural, spiritual, economic, or recreational. And then there's 8 bullets that further define that OWEB goal. And one of the bullets states involvement of the next generation in the conservation effort. And this is a great goal, but unfortunately the proposed rules may severely limit the implementation of that goal by OWEB. In past years, OWEB, and before that, GWEB, some of you all might remember the organization that predated OWEB. GWEB invested staff time and funding into outreach and education materials, creating and distributing water conservation pamphlets, flyers, posters, worked with the Oregon Lottery to put together billboards that you would see up around the state. You would also see full-page newspaper ads about restoration projects that have been achieved across the state in the hopes that others in other locations could do a similar project. And this was at a time when OWEB staff totaled about 12 people. OWEB was able to achieve a lot, and I at the same time that OWEB was doing that work out of the Salem office, we also had partners on the ground like my Watershed Council, other councils, conservation districts, and other organizations were doing outreach work in their basins, informing everyone from 9-year-olds to 90-year-olds the importance of watershed restoration and what each of those Oregonians can do to help achieve that. These partnering organizations have used school field trips, summer science camps, project tours, presentations to civic clubs, project workshops, and trainings to achieve watershed awareness and awareness about potential restoration projects. I think these project partnerships were created, out of this effort, project partnerships were created and restoration projects were accomplished. And I think this work must continue. I've been doing this work for 20 years, as I stated before, and the younger generations that we worked with in the late 1990s, they're now helping their families run their orchards, their vineyards, their livestock operations. They're making decisions about how they're managing water, they're making decisions about riparian areas, and how just their grazing management. And is OWEB really willing to lose this outreach partnership based on an interpretation of a rule by an individual? I hope not. But if so, if OWEB does feel truly constrained by the interpretation of that rule, then I think that OWEB could look to see what other funding they could use to at least help out with that education component. And by providing some funding they could provide, OWEB could provide leverage that we could use as a tool to find other foundation dollars, other agency dollars to continue our education and outreach program. It wouldn't take much. I'm thinking somewhere along the lines of 1% of the OWEB biennium budget of $117 million. $1 million per biennium could go a long way. Watershed councils and conservation districts have been used to getting by with very little. We can stretch those dollars. OWEB can try to continue to do outreach from Salem like in the old days, but I think it would be a lot more effective if you worked with the partners out on the ground. And I do wonder about the operating funds, and was wondering if we could hear a little bit about whether there are operating funds that could help to backfill this. Thank you.
Wow, right on time. Thank you. Comments, questions from the board?
And Brian, I can speak to you. I'd be glad to chat with you about the operating piece, because I can walk you through that. Your last question about the operating fund, I'd be glad to spend some time with you and whoever and talk to you about that piece.
That was Maida Lofsgarden, for the record.
Yes, for the record.
And this is Brian Wolcott again. Is that something we could discuss right now? I don't know if the board's aware of.
Oh, is the board, would you guys like absolutely, if the board would like a response to that piece as well. So we have two fund types. The grant fund, which you control, which is 65% of the Measure 76 lottery funds and all of the Pacific Coastal Salmon Recovery funds. The Constitution then sets up an operating fund, which has a different set of purposes under the Constitution. The operating fund purpose includes education. The operating fund is not managed by the board, it is managed by the legislature, and it includes a number of things like enforcement of wildlife, it includes water quality, it includes a suite of things. That is the money that the legislature then uses. Part of it is administering the grant program, so OWEB's funding for our staff comes from the operating fund, as does funding for agencies like the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, or Oregon Department of Forestry, Oregon Department of Agriculture, and others. Our Department of Environmental Quality are funded through that program. The State Police Habitat or Wildlife Division is funded under that program as well. When the framers redid the Constitution, they explicitly moved education out of the grant program and moved it into the operating program. And so that's where you see in Bruce Taylor's comments that this is still an authorized function. It is authorized under a different fund, which is not a fund that the board controls, it's a fund that the legislature controls. And so in Bruce's comments, which are correct, I think he's number 3 under the comment letters, should a group choose to, they could have a conversation with the legislature about the use of operating funds for education. I think the challenge, Brian, you having been around in this world for a long, long time, is that challenge of competing priorities, right? So with a $1.4 billion deficit, you have to come into the legislature and have a conversation about this fund in that conversation around the agency funding. But it is absolutely where the framers of the Constitution placed that debate is over on the operating side. So we're more than happy to follow up with you and the network and others and just talk to you about what that technically looks like and how that conversation could occur. It's a legislative conversation.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Any more questions for Brian? All right, thank you very much, Brian. Appreciate it. Okay, so now we move to the board.
We don't have to,
Discussion and deliberation on this.
yeah.
So Eric is going to frame up a way to approach this.
Okay, and we have
20
appropriate
minutes.
quorum.
Oh, it's not a funding decision, so we do have one.
Go ahead.
Okay, Eric Williams, OWEB Grant Program Manager. So the task in front of you is to decide whether to adopt the entire suite of the proposed rules. And it includes what was initially put out for public comment, and then those changes made in response to public comment, which were in red, plus those few changes recommended by our attorney at the Department of Justice. And so I think maybe a good way to do this is I'll walk through the proposed rules section by section and ask whether there are items within each of those sections that you'd like to discuss so that we can manage our time. And then after we go through the whole thing, then we'll have the discussion on those pieces that you want more time on. So first, the purpose section. Is that a section people want to have some discussion?
Do you want to cover the title?
We can cover the title. Would you like more time on the title?
So we're not going to discuss it. You just show of hand. If you have a thing here, we just need to know where we have things. Okay, so you guys do on the first one.
No, this is another comment. I think it would be helpful for the board to get a historical basically this is about whether we're in the education business or not, and the upshot is that we're not. And I think it would be useful for the board to get a historical perspective of what OWEB has done in the past in this realm. We're cutting out a activity that was part of OWEB for many years. And I don't remember the numbers, but you mentioned 500,000 that was split between outreach and education. I would, just for my own recollection, how much per year was OWEB historically spending for what we would consider education?
So for the record, Maida Lofsgarden, the full outreach category was 500,000 to 600,000. The staff did an analysis of that to determine what level of those, and I'm going to do this a little bit briefly, only because you guys have been talking about this for about the last year. So I just want to make sure we're hitting on the things that are most salient to you. So Eric, do you remember the number when you guys went through the evaluation?
It was right around half, around 49% of those funded projects between 2012 and the present were education projects and really not eligible under the constitutional language.
Okay.
Okay.
You want to proceed? Go ahead.
All right. Are there folks who want to have some discussion on the purpose section? Just show of hands. Okay. The definitions section? No one? Okay. The eligible and ineligible project type section? None. The application requirements section? None. The evaluation criteria section? None. The technical review process section? None. And the staff funding recommendation process section? The board funding decision section? Grant agreement conditions? And finally, waiver and periodic review of rules. Okay, so it looks like we want to talk about the title and the purpose in more detail. So regarding the title, I think we had some conversation about that earlier where the board subcommittee had talked about it at length and really wanted to differentiate this offering because of the mixture of education and outreach projects that have been funded in recent years. And so based on that strong desire, and after quite a bit of discussion, we came up with stakeholder engagement grants as a descriptive title of what we want to offer. Now, our attorneys reviewed that and were fine with it. Their change to make sure we got the word outreach in there was in the purpose section. So questions or comments about the title, stakeholder engagement grants?
Jason?
And Jason Robinson. So Eric, as we look at the Attorney General's comments with regards to outreach grants, if the title reads stakeholder engagement grants and then we use outreach grants for the purpose, I think the title would still read clear as outreach grants, but still leave the stakeholder engagement portion of it to kind of redefine what outreach grants are. Might make more sense. When I read the title, stakeholder engagement grants, and then I go to the purpose, if we leave the outreach grants in there, then I've got two conflicting grant types. So it concerns me a little bit that we have that conflict in there. Thank you.
So you're suggesting, Will Newhouser, that it should say outreach grants for stakeholder engagement? Is that what you...
That something in the title has to refer back to outreach grants if we're going to have outreach grants remain in the purpose of the statement. So.
Stephen and Bob?
Yeah, it could hide the same bit of confusion. There's a couple ways to solve it. You could just start off with stakeholder engagement projects and leave it as it is, or you could do it, as you suggested, outreach grants with a subtitle of stakeholder engagement projects.
Bob?
Bob Weber, I think I still, and so that everybody knows, I don't think anybody at this table doesn't like the concept of outreach grants and education and those kinds of things. This whole process was because we had been in violation of our constitutional mandates for 4 or 5 years, and we needed to bring it into conformity. And I still think that to make that break, that we ought to not have outreach in there, because I think it creates confusion amongst our stakeholders as to what these are. And so, you know, I would go back to what was originally in there with leaving the outreach out of the purpose, so that it just provide grants instead of outreach grants, because I think that just adds to the confusion that we were trying to avoid.
Rosemary?
Rosemary Furphy. A couple things there. By not having outreach grants in the title, we do the first couple of words under the purpose is to provide outreach grants. So we say it there, but we don't have it in the title. I think we need to resolve that. And then the other is stakeholder. From my understanding, I think stakeholders is a narrower definition, but it's interesting when I go to the definition of stakeholder engagement project, it includes community, which is very, very broad, and you can't even name all the different parts, components of a community. So I guess I'm wrestling a little bit now with stakeholder seems fairly narrow, yet in the definition we are talking about community. And so it almost, the title seems to limit it, yet the definition is extremely broad. And again, how do we resolve that?
Yeah.
Steve has a response.
Okay.
Yeah,
Stephen?
stakeholders is, in the world of stakeholder engagement, really means everyone, and particularly the way it's used here. Every citizen is a stakeholder because they live in a watershed. There's some, whether they know it or not, they are a stakeholder. So stakeholder term is very broad, and I hate to go back to the to our strategic planning effort, but we use the word, if you just look under, I hate to go back to box A, I'm sure you're all memorized that, but there's things like two-way communication, helping stakeholders for the future, engaging stakeholders. It's all replete in our strategic planning effort. So in that case, we use the term stakeholder very broadly, including every citizen. So I think in that we're being consistent with what we're putting together in our strategic planning, and you know, maybe we need to be, if there is question, more specific to define stakeholders, you know, as broadly as we intend to use it.
This is Eric. Did you have a comment?
Yeah, Eric Williams, OWEB staff. The intention here is, as Stephen pointed out, to define stakeholder broadly. Now, that definition can broaden or narrow depending on the kind of project you're talking about. Some projects just have more stakeholders than others. So it really does depend on the outcomes that you're looking for. In some of the examples that Maida brought up, such as dam removal projects, it really can be an entire community that are the stakeholders that you need to engage with to help get that project launched successfully. And so these funds are intended to do the work required to do that communication with whoever needs to be communicated with. And that is going to vary quite a bit from project to project and program to program.
Dan, and then
Yeah.
Ron.
Yeah, Dan Thorndike. I was just going to say that actually that very broad definition is what kind of made me feel okay with having the word in there, which I probably wouldn't have otherwise. But it's so broad, it's fine. I think it addresses that.
Ron.
Just an observation. I Ron Alvarado, tend to agree with Rosemary on that term. Stakeholder to me seems very agency, determined. Yes, and if you would ask someone in the community what stakeholder is, they may have various definitions of what that means. Community to me just brings out what we're trying to accomplish is to reach out to a broad, in some cases, a broad audience into the process. So anyways, just an observation. I'm struggling with stakeholder, but I can go either way.
Will Newhouser, I'm perfectly comfortable with it, because we have it in the definition. We're defining what it is in the definition, so that's what it means. You don't get to bring other ideas of what you think it might mean because it's defined here. A slight Scrivener's question is, should in the purpose stakeholder engagement projects be capitalized since it's going to be used formally given the definition?
Eric Williams, OWEB staff. I believe the rulemaking rules frown on capitalization of things like that.
All right. Any other comments at this point? Since we're not voting yet, we're just trying to get more info on the items that were identified. So, title and purpose. Were there any other sections that?
That was it.
That was it. Okay. So I would entertain a motion.
Question or point of order referring to that. This is Dan. That reference to OAR 695.015.0050. I don't think it's even supposed to be 010.0050 or the application requirements for restoration. It's not criteria.
Where
so I'm just
are
wondering
you?
if we have just the wrong. I don't know what that's supposed to be.
Which
This is, I'm sorry. On
page
the point that
3.2a.
Bob raised under, it's under 695.015XXXX. Does that help? No.
Page 3, number
It's on page
2A, review and
Page
evaluate
3,
each
2A.
project individually.
Yes, thank you. Eric Williams, OWEB staff. Thank you for pointing that out. The correct reference there, it should have read 695-015-XXX because it's referring
Got it.
to
That
the evaluation criteria section on the page before, which will get a number, and so that number would be inserted where the X's are.
Randy?
I have a motion. I move the board approve the stakeholder engagement grants rules as specified in attachment D to the staff report.
With the correction?
Friendly amendment, Eric Williams, OWEB staff, with or without the attorney's comments that are in yellow on the handout.
With the yellow comments
And the technical.
And the technical correction.
and the technical correction offered by many people.
Do I have a second?
Second, Jason Robinson.
Jason seconded.
I have a discussion question.
Carl?
As a theoretical question, to help me understand what we're doing here, within these rules, if you are a watershed council, and this is theoretical, and you wanted to institute a beaver restoration project, you didn't have a specific, but you knew you wanted to do beaver restoration, would you be able to apply through these rules for a stakeholder outreach for education about beaver ecosystem function? I mean, would that fit under this?
Eric Williams, OWEB staff. Yes, you would be able to apply. I think your success would depend on how well you've defined the need for restoration, how well you've looked at the geography in your particular watershed.
Well, the usual criteria.
The usual criteria around that.
But you would
Yes.
not be precluded
No.
from that.
No.
As Will Newhouser, as long as you could identify that it was intended to happen in a specific place, site, as it says in 1A, within a specific time frame, within the next 3 years or something.
Yeah.
Yes, Eric Williams again. Yes, it does say project sites, but also says or programmatically to result in selecting project sites. So you don't have to have the specific beaver restoration sites in mind. You could do stakeholder engagement to build support for implementing beaver restoration in a particular geography at sites that could be determined at a later time.
And with that, I would submit that that interpretation of these rules somehow needs to be communicated to the, I don't mean beaver specifically, I just mean in general, that be communicated to our stakeholders to know what is possible.
Yes, Eric Williams, OWEB staff, we are working to incorporate that into the guidance that accompanies the application on the online solicitation, and we'll provide specific examples to help people think about things along those lines. We may have even incorporated beaver, but I'd have to go back and look.
So I think we should make sure that our questions are directed towards the motion and any potential amendments. Alan, and then Bob.
It's not directly directed towards the motion, but it's more in line with Carl's questions, so I'm not sure.
Is it something we can discuss, you can discuss with staff, or is it something that you need to discuss?
It's clarifying the intent of the motion. And following in Carl's logic then, and maybe tying it more closely to home, if in Klamath Basin they're taking out 4 dams, and if OWEB's not contributing to that effort, can somebody come in and still apply for a project to educate the community on the removal of those dams, even though we're not funding any of that action?
Yes, thank you. Eric Williams, OWEB staff. Yes, they could come in for that kind of project. It just says that the projects that you're working toward have to be eligible for under OWEB's programs for restoration. It doesn't say they have to be funded by OWEB. So yes, they could come in for that kind of a project.
Bob Weber.
Back to the OARs, I still don't like the concept that outreach is included in the purpose, so for that reason I would vote against it. Not that I'm against the concepts and the rest of the OAR proposed.
Let's see, we have a motion and a second. I don't see any more discussion, so all those in favor of the motion as presented?
Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed?
Nay.
That's a nay by Bob Weber. Okay, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
So
Motion passes, break.
motion passes, and we're going to take our break. Do we want to?
It would
When do
be
we want to return here?
great if it could be a 10-minute break.
So back here at 10:25.
Randy Labby, co-chair, and I refer you to item J, FIP implementation monitoring update. I'd like to welcome Robert and Ryan and Renee.
Thanks, Randy. Good morning, co-chairs, members of the board. For the record, Renee Davis, Deputy Director. So as Randy noted, we are on agenda item J, which is the FIP implementation monitoring update. I mentioned this during my introduction of Jennifer's agenda item as another refresher. The board provided funding in April of 2016 to have Bonneville Environmental Foundation, BEF, assist the board and staff in developing approaches for both assessing the partnership capacity building that we're supporting as part of the FIP investments, but then also to develop a progress monitoring framework for the implementation FIP. So the reason behind that latter piece is the implementation FIPs are without question targeted at partnerships coming together to make demonstrable progress towards specific ecological outcomes. And so we, as part of the FIP implementation granting process, have provided space for each of the FIP partnerships to come in and propose monitoring that would help with some of that tracking towards progress on outcomes. However, there is certainly the need and interest for the board to be able to have some consistent way to really understand what that progress towards outcomes is that is associated with your FIP investments. So given that we know we need a consistent approach to do that, but we still need the ability to capture the unique nature of each of the 6 implementation FIPs, you understand the diversity with that, we were scratching our heads saying, how would we do that? How would we put a framework like that in place? So in working with BEF that has extensive experience in putting together monitoring frameworks and approaches like this with groups throughout the West, you heard public comment from an individual from Montana yesterday that has a connection with some of the work that BEF has done in Montana. So we brought on BEF to really help us determine what would that monitoring framework look like that would give the board the ability to really understand what are our investments providing, return on investment, around ecological outcomes, but still have the ability to really embrace and respect the unique nature of each one of those implementation FIPs. So Ryan and Robert are here today to provide the first of 2 updates about the progress monitoring framework for the implementation FIPs. This is more of an introduction, if you will. It's pretty complicated and meaty in terms of the process that they're going through with each of the FIPs. So this will help to really orient the board to how the process works, including the results chain process that I've provided some brief updates about to you at past meetings, and start to give you a glimpse of where BEF is in their work with the 6 implementation FIPs. We'll invite them to come back again in October and to really get into, these are the findings, this is where we've landed with the results chains with each of the implementation FIPs, and also to really begin to give the board a sense of how well the proposed monitoring that the implementation FIPs came in with really sets us up to be able to track progress, and where we might have some monitoring gaps that we would continue to work with the individual FIPs to identify, and could result in the board seeing some subsequent monitoring asks from the implementation FIPs to fully populate the need around the monitoring coverage that will help us to be able to track progress through time. So that's just teeing up for you how this will proceed in terms of both understanding BEF's work on the progress monitoring framework, and then helping you to also understand that you may see some additional funding requests from the implementation FIPs around monitoring. So Robert Warren is with BEF. Ryan Houston, you know well, from Upper Deschutes Watershed Council. Ryan is wearing a different hat today. He is part of the BEF team that's been helping with the progress monitoring framework development, so he'll be focusing on that part of his work rather than representing the Deschutes partnership today. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Q.
Excellent. Thank you, Renee. Again, my name's Ryan Houston with the Upper Deschutes Watershed Council in my day job, but on this particular project, working as part of the BEF team, and very pleased to be able to be part of this project. It's an incredibly interesting endeavor, and hope to share some of the sort of general themes and approaches with you all today. The way we're going to structure it here is I'm going to provide a little bit of introductory information, sort of tee it up, talk about goals, objectives, that sort of thing, and then hand it over to Robert, who's going to dig into some of the details. But before I start, I would like to just thank the OWEB team that we've been working with. We connect about every 6 weeks or so on this project. We've had some really incredible discussion, some really good brainstorming, some conversation about how do we tackle some of these challenging problems. And so it's been a really interesting process, and I think a really productive process. So I really appreciate the work of the OWEB staff in connecting and having good dialogue about this effort. So let me jump in. We are going to talk about a number of things today, and that little button is not working. There we go. Now it's working. We're going to talk about our work with the existing FIPs, and in that, we're going to answer a couple of basic questions. What are we doing and why? We're going to talk about the progress monitoring framework, as we're calling it. What is it? How does it work? That's where this will get a little meaty. And then we're going to talk about some of our observations and reflections. What are we learning thus far? And that's a bit of a teaser as to where we're headed with this project, and we can then follow up on some of those in more detail when we come back in October. I want to reflect for a moment here on how this connects with OWEB's larger work. OWEB has had a longstanding interest in measuring its own mission impact. This is from a slide from January of 2016 at the OWEB board, where OWEB was talking about how does OWEB as an organization, as an entity, measure impact from the highest level of the mission all the way down through the programs, all the way down into administration. And so OWEB has a very longstanding interest in looking at various ways to measure impacts. And so really what our work is focused on is building on this existing foundation of trying to really dig down into the FIPS and look at how do we measure impact, effectiveness, outcomes, ecological successes, and that sort of thing in the FIP program. So it's in this context of OWEB's existing interest in measuring mission impact. And one very important part of this is that we're also setting this up to be complementary to the monitoring work that the FIPS are doing themselves. And so when you read all those FIP applications for the 6 implementation FIPS a couple of years ago, you saw that they all had their own monitoring programs. And so this work here is not intended to overlap or duplicate or replace, but instead intended to build upon and leverage the existing work of the FIPS. So we're trying to build from where OWEB has been, and we're also trying to build from where the FIPS currently are so that we can add value rather than create duplication. So one of the key goals here, as Renee mentioned, is to build a framework that can work within the FIPS as well as across the FIPS. And if you look at this map and you remember the 6 FIP organizations, just looking at the shapes of these polygons across the landscape, these are very diverse partnerships, from the oak woodlands down in the Ashland area, out to sage grouse country, wetlands out in the Malheur region, number of areas focused in on fish up in the Grand Ronde and the Willamette and the Deschutes. We're dealing with different landscapes, and we're dealing with very diverse geographic, social, political, organizational dynamics. And so even though this is a family of 6 implementation FIPS, it's a very diverse family. It's a modern family, shall we say, of very diverse groups that work in very different landscapes. And so one of the fundamental challenges when we look at that is, if we're going to try to answer a couple of key questions here in the middle, how do we track and communicate progress? How do we learn? Those kinds of questions. One of the key challenges we have is there are a number of very complex confounding variables. We have diverse, complex ecological systems, as I noted, varying scopes and scales. You look at something like sage grouse, where they're working in a very focused region here, but they're in the context of the western U.S. and the entire distribution of sage grouse across the West. Limited duration funding. 6-year FIP funding is long-term funding in the funding world. It's short-term funding in the ecological world. There are also various external factors and influences, whether those are conditions on the Columbia that affect migrating fish, climate change, rangeland conditions outside of focal areas, whatever it may be. And so it's really tricky to try to tease apart the impacts, effects, outcomes of the FIP work given all of these confounding variables. And so what we are focusing in on is using what we're calling this progress monitoring framework, which is a set of tools that's based on a graphical model that's designed to articulate, and I know I'm starting to use a bunch of words here with lots of syllables in them, designed to articulate very explicit relationships between what you're doing, your strategies, what you're producing immediately, your outputs, your ultimate outcomes, and then your impacts. And we're going to dive into that in detail here in a minute. But really what we're talking about here is using a graphical model to try to illustrate this complexity so that we can then begin to understand the complexity, track it, communicate it, and evaluate effectiveness. And I would like to note, too, that when I use the word evaluate, we're not so much talking about scoring. This isn't pass-fail. This isn't A, B, C, D or F kind of grading. This is about understanding so that it can be evaluated in the sense of learning, adaptive management, and continued progress. It's really not about scoring, pass, fail, that type of thing. So when we got started on this project, we wanted to first take a look and ask the questions about, who else has done this kind of work. We're not the first folks to have wrestled with these types of problems. And I wanted to point out one of the sources that's turned out to be a really good resource for us. If you need help sleeping at night, this is a really good opportunity. It's about 150 pages long, but it really digs into a lot of what we're going to be talking about today. This is a publication put together by the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, a national association of agencies including ODF and W. And essentially what they were doing is looking at asking, how can we measure the effectiveness of grants that are coming from the federal government to various state and wildlife agencies essentially asking, how do we track what we're accomplishing with these dollars? So very analogous to what's happening here, where OWEB is investing in these FIPs. And I pulled this quote, and I want to just highlight a couple of words. This quote says, it's been an ongoing challenge to assess and communicate the effectiveness of the blank programs, doesn't matter what the acronyms are, because complex biological and ecological interactions make it difficult to attribute changes. So attribution is difficult given the complexity in species or habitat status to the effects of any single action, and it can take decades for species to recover once conservation work begins. So we have difficulty with attribution, we have time challenges, we have sort of response issues, we have communication challenges, and we also have the simple measurement or assessment challenges. And so we're not, and when I say we, I mean the conservation community here in Oregon, including OWEB, we're not alone in facing this challenge of asking, how do we track and measure and evaluate and communicate this effectiveness? And there are some really good resources out there that we can learn from and we can build on. These folks spent a lot of money, a lot of work sessions, over a couple of years, and they basically developed a framework that works for 11 different types of conservation programs. And so our work here is built on tweaking this and simplifying it and trying to adapt it to the unique situation here in Oregon. If anyone's interested in these details, happy to send the report to you guys. And then, whether it's that citation or any of the others, most of these approaches are based on some kind of a logic model. And so I want to just highlight a couple here, because we're going to be digging into an example here in just a minute. This is an example that shows two different types of models. The top one is sort of a standard logic model. You've seen those before. You've seen them before in presentations before the OWEB board. It's a fairly basic concept that says, okay, you put something in, you have inputs, then you create something where you have outputs. Those lead to outcomes, and then you get an impact. Fairly general inputs are things like dollars or resources. Outputs are things like number of trees planted, number of miles fenced, whatever it may be, and you move on down the line. The kind of model that we're using here is generically called a theory of change model. We're going to talk about it as a results chain, but it's designed to be a lot more explicit and more detailed. And so you can look at these and you say, come on, Ryan, they're different colors and different shapes, but they fundamentally look the same, because you read them from left to right and there are a series of boxes. But what the theory of change model is designed to do is to actually detail the interactions between specific strategies, specific results, specific outcomes, try to get at understanding what the assumptions are in those linkages, and then try to get at real cause and effect relationships that can be tested or evaluated through some type of monitoring evaluation. So the concept here is to recognize that the basic logic model has a lot of value in certain settings, but if we're working in these kinds of complex systems, we need to go a little bit deeper. And that's essentially what we're doing here, is going one step deeper into these details. There are plenty of folks out there who have dug into these details and talked about exactly how to do this type of work. And so this is a reference that really sets up the framework for the exact work that we're doing, the methods that we're doing, the approaches that we're using. And so here's where I want to turn it over to Robert so he can dig into some of these details.
Thanks, Ryan. So this is Robert Warren with BEF. I wanted to sort of echo Ryan's expression of gratitude to OWEB staff. It's really been a collaborative process, so those meetings we really look forward to sort of talking through some of the issues and challenges that we're facing as we're putting this thing together and what we're finding as we're out in the field talking to folks. So really appreciate that sort of a collaborative approach to this process, and to the board as well for this opportunity for us to be able to engage with this diverse array of partnerships. These are really impressive folks out there. It's always impressive and inspiring for us to engage with people that are really committed and dedicated to the stewardship of their watershed, sheds and landscapes. So just wanted to sort of build on the gratitude that's been expressed here already today for this project. It's really an exciting one for us. So to continue on with this presentation, so as Ryan said, there are lots of people struggling with these kinds of issues around how do you design conservation initiatives, how do you monitor them, how do you track progress. So there's been a group called the Conservation Measures Partnership. It's a partnership of conservation organizations that have been really trying to sort of bring together all these sort of common concepts, ideas, methodologies, terms, to have some consistency across these efforts and develop an approach that can be comparable. And so we're definitely not sort of advocating for the application of open standards for all these kinds of things. And we've found certain aspects of it to be really useful in certain situations. So in this case, we're only sort of applying one of the tools that has come out of this open standards, and that's the results chain or the theory of change model. So you've got a little introduction, you've got some materials I think that you've been receiving over time. So what is this results chain thing that we've been talking about and sort of advocating for its use? And so as Ryan said, it's a graphical model or a graphical representation of a theory of change. It's a series of predicted results. And those sort of predicted results, there are linkages between those, the relationships between those predicted results. It provides practitioners an opportunity to reveal underlying assumptions in their theory and to have discussions about that so that there's sort of common knowledge, common understanding within a partnership about what their assumptions are. And it also helps practitioners identify where some of the key uncertainties are in terms of what are those different results. So in some cases, the results may be obvious and clear, and there may be a high confidence that those results will be produced, but in some cases, there's some questions about that. There might be some lower probabilities, or there may be some information that's required for them to really know whether those results are going to occur, or some things need to happen for those results to occur. And so generally it supports this framework for monitoring progress and adapting these kinds of conservation initiatives. So it's a series of geometric shapes that are linked by these connected directional arrows. And I think you can read this from where you're sitting. So on the left, the hexagon there is sort of the strategy. On the far right is the ecological priority. So that's the thing that people care about. They want to improve or protect its status. And the 4 boxes in the middle sort of represent different kinds of results that you might expect if you're able to successfully implement your strategy. So we have implementation results, something that, sort of the outputs piece. We have a reduction in threats that may be desired, where threats are more clearly or explicitly identified by a partnership. You have near and long-term intermediate ecological results. So what are sort of the precursors that you expect before you get that long-term ecological impact? And so you want to identify those just to see if the things are sort of happening in the sequence that you expect them to happen to produce that long-term ecological impact. And so these shapes are connected by directional arrows, and the arrows can be sort of viewed as if-then statements. So if you get one result, then you expect the subsequent result to occur. And so this, again, laying out your theory and your thinking for how the long-term ecological impacts are hopefully being produced. Anywhere along this sort of results chain, whether it's implementation results, whether it's reduction in threats, or whether it's ecological responses, there are opportunities for practitioners or partners to identify specific objectives. So if they expect this result to occur, how much of that result needs to occur, when does it need to occur in order for the subsequent result to occur. So anywhere along that line, there's the opportunity for objectives, and you might expect that objectives around implementation results are fairly simple and straightforward, and that's usually the case. Those objectives, or people get a little less comfortable as you move from left to right on this results chain in terms of defining specific objectives. And with those objectives, that would help define sort of a monitoring framework for what are the things that you're going to be measuring. Again, implementation, which is sort of the implementation monitoring, threat reductions or intermediate ecological results, which would be sort of the effectiveness monitoring, and looking at goals and monitoring around the status of your ecological priority, which would be sort of the status and trends monitoring. So there's a couple of things about this results chain that I sort of want to highlight. One is that, and I sort of brought this up already, is that as you move from left to right on this results chain, the level of uncertainty sort of increases. You have a really good, sort of a high level of confidence in terms of implementation results that you're able to produce. You may have a high confidence in terms of the threats you're able to reduce, but that confidence sort of diminishes a little bit as you go sort of further into the future over time and start to see what kind of ecological responses you might expect. The other thing is that, and this may seem obvious, is that the cost for monitoring as you move from left to right will increase. So the cost of monitoring implementation results may be relatively low compared to the cost to monitoring ecological responses to your actions and especially the status and trends of the ecological priorities that you're hoping to improve. The other thing is that the results chain sort of as a tool or as a thing, you know, the real value, at least the greatest value that we find in it, is the actual process of creating it. It's sort of getting people in the room to sort of talk about, sort of have a lively dialogue and a rich dialogue about what are the theories, what are the assumptions, those kinds of things. So in and of itself, you know, it has some value in sort of documenting that thinking and documenting those conversations, but by itself, it's just a series of boxes and arrows. So in practice, the results chain might look something like this. So this is, we're calling it a hypothetical results chain. We used one of the results chains that we've been developing with one of the FIP partners, so it's kind of obvious where it came from. But don't pay any attention to the content because it's not accurate. We changed things enough that, that it's not anything that you can use to evaluate them on their results chain development. But just wanted to give you a sense of what a results chain in practice might look like. Again, as you're moving from left to right, you have strategies. And in this case, the strategic action plan consists of two primary strategies. One is focused on forest thinning and prescribed fire. The other strategy is focused on community outreach and communications, which I guess it turns out is timely for today. The other end, ecological priorities include sort of forested habitats in the uplands as well as aquatic habitats. So the related aquatic habitats that are associated with those forested habitats. So we have a series of implementation results, which are these light blue boxes, a series of threat reductions. So in this case, the partnerships identified some very specific threats that they believe needed to be reduced in order to achieve their long-term goals. And then these lighter blue boxes here are those ecological responses or ecological results that they expect to occur. So I don't know if you guys can read on the...
We can see it though.
Okay, and that's fine. So I just sort of walk through, just to give you an example, I'll walk through one of the threads here, just to give you a sense of what it might look like. And again, this has been simplified and it's hypothetical, so don't worry yourselves too much about the content or the specific, but just sort of how the process might work. So again, one of the strategies here is sort of forest thinning and prescribed fire. So if we follow the prescribed fire thread, in many cases, a lot of the strategies, even through implementation, require some assessment, some site identification, potentially some outreach. So there's some setting up that needs to be done. So in many cases, the initial implementation results relate to going through that assessment process, identifying appropriate sites to apply those kinds of treatments. So on the fire side of things, the first implementation result is that fire management opportunities are identified. So if fire management opportunities are identified, then prescribed fire is used as a management tool. But you also get some vegetation, another result, vegetation impairing large tree branching is removed. So some change in the habitat structure is starting to occur through your implementation. If prescribed fire is used as a management tool, then you expect tree and fuel density to be reduced. You also expect the risk of catastrophic fire to be reduced. So these are a couple of results that you expect from, again, from this sort of thread or this series of results. If you're able to successfully achieve those implementation results, there are a couple of threats that were identified. One associated with the frequency of severe wildfire, so that you're moving from sort of this unnatural range of risk to something that's more acceptable or sort of within the range of acceptability. And you expect a reduction in the severe outbreaks of forest insects and diseases. So if those threats are reduced, as well as if you get some of these implementation results, you begin to see some ecological responses. And typically the initial ecological responses that folks identify are more sort of structural to habitat. And if you get those changes in the structure of the habitat, then the processes and the ecological systems begin to respond. So these sort of define some of those ecological sort of structural habitat responses. And then the species will hopefully respond to that as well. So one of the expected or desired results is that forest-dependent wildlife habitat protected and improved, and that the resilience to drought, extreme fire, insects, and disease had increased, and if those results are achieved, then you start to see an increase or an improvement in the status of those ecological priorities. So I know that's sort of tough to follow, a lot of detail there, but hopefully you're getting sort of a sense of how you sort of build these out. It may seem simplistic, but it really, it may be that some of the partners are sort of viewing things differently, or their assumptions may be differently in terms of how they expect or hope their strategies to produce, will produce the outcomes that they want. So as I mentioned, the strategic action plan also consists of outreach and communications. So in many cases, outreach and communications is integrated, and this is an opportunity for those things to be integrated strategically to help provide or help to develop the enabling conditions for you to successfully achieve or implement strategies that are more project-oriented, that may be more sort of on-the-ground treatments or on-the-ground projects. So, sort of going back to the discussion earlier, that when you think about communications and outreach, the results chains offer an opportunity to be more explicit in terms of how you expect those kinds of things to actually, like I said, sort of build or support the conditions that are required for strategy implementation on the project side of things. And you can be very specific and clear about that through the development of a results chain. So again, once this is laid out, there's an opportunity for the partners to sort of sit down and figure out, well, where do we need to assign or define specific objectives in order to, either demonstrate that we're making progress, to validate or invalidate our assumptions, or to identify where some of those key critical uncertainties are, things that might need to be measured, just to see if we're getting the kind of responses that we're expecting. So there are implementation objectives that can be defined. There are a series of effectiveness-related objectives that can be defined in terms of the results around threat reductions and producing near and long-term ecological results. And goals can be assigned sort of to say, this is the desired future condition that we want to see for the ecological priorities, the things that we've decided that we care about, that we're trying to have a positive impact on. And then sort of laying out those objectives, then sort of the monitoring can be laid over the top of that. So you can identify what kinds of things do you need to measure, over what time frame, what are the indicators, what are the specific metrics that we might measure. So, so why is it that we think results chains, if we haven't convinced you already, why do we think results chains are a good idea for the FIPS, at least in this situation? So, from our standpoint, ideally, these results chains or this project monitoring framework provides benefits at all levels, not just within the FIPS, but even external to the FIPS. But internal to the FIPS, as we've discussed, it's a framework for learning and adapting strategies. It also helps promote self-accountability so that the partners can hold each other accountable for the goals that they set for themselves. So once there's agreement in terms of the strategies, what results are expected, what the objectives are, what the measures are, what the monitoring is, and people sort of have assigned responsibility to those things, it sort of hopefully creates this sort of hopefully friendly, but sort of this internal self-accountability within the FIP. And if everybody's sort of on the same page and sort of thinking about their strategies, what the outcomes are that they're hoping for and how they expect to get there, then you would hope that the communication sort of external to the FIP, regardless of who the partner is consistent and clear and sort of makes sense. So external to the FIP, and we'll talk about this here in a minute, but in every case, the FIPs are operating within a larger regional context and sometimes in a larger regional sort of conservation initiative. So sort of bringing this sort of coherency in terms of the theory, the strategy, the monitoring, that sort of thing, we were hoping that it sort of allows them to better integrate into those larger regional conservation and monitoring contexts. And hopefully, and this is one of the main purposes for doing this, that it helps funders, see progress beyond just the output. So beyond just the project implementation side of things, see what the theory is and see what can be expected in terms of results around effectiveness and see what results may be expected in terms of status and trends of those ecological priorities. And we hope that it also informs their broader practice. So if there's a consistent way that FIPs are measuring things amongst themselves, sort of even within the state of Oregon, there's an opportunity for cross-FIP or cross-partnership communication, learning, and that sort of thing. So people can look at each other's results chains if they want to share them. and understand sort of how they're going about doing their work. And if there's some similarities in terms of, some learning that can be, where the FIPS are trying to achieve similar outcomes, then we hope that this helps to promote that. There's also some cautions. So none of these sort of frameworks are perfect. And they usually come with some caveats. And so this is sort of speaking to results chain development, but also open standards, more largely, that any of this stuff requires significant investment of time, and a lot of times planning fatigue can be set in, especially for folks that are more accustomed to doing the project implementation work. And so they get antsy and they want to go outside. We just want to do some work. We want to stop doing sort of this planning process. And it can be tedious, and like I said, it can be time-consuming, and it can be, the conversations can be fairly difficult, but I think always rich. And this is just a tool, so there's nothing really magic about a results chain. It really reflects the existing sort of state of knowledge around adaptive management, or at least what's been developed over the years. But we just think it's a great tool, and through our experience, has been a great tool to help groups sort of think through their work and develop monitoring plans that are hopefully useful and inform adaptive management. Results chains can never reflect the actual level of complexity that these groups face. So there's a lot of social complexity, there's ecological complexity, and so there needs to be a recognition that you need to stop at some point, that you can never make this perfect, but you just need to make it useful. So some balance between that. The law of diminishing returns definitely applies in results chains. You get too many boxes and arrows, and eventually the usefulness of it sort of diminishes pretty quickly. So some discipline in terms of developing this to make sure that usefulness is retained or maintained. And results chains don't work for everyone. Not everybody looks at the world with boxes and arrows. Some people prefer matrices, some people prefer narratives, but we think that a results chain allows you to easily translate into these other ways of thinking about how these systems work, or how a strategic plan is defined. Okay, 5 minutes left. So I'm going to go really fast. So what's our process been? So we have reviewed strategic action plans, we've reviewed monitoring plans, and we've developed draft results chains on our own, sort of our interpretation. We've presented those results chains to the FIPS, either full groups or subgroups, and sought feedback and recruited folks to come and work with us to develop those, to make sure that they're accurate further, and to sort of shift the ownership of what we're doing. Not necessarily that we had ownership, but sort of to shift the ownership to the FIPS so that they actually own these results chains. So we've worked collaboratively to ground truth and refine those results chains. And so we're sort of in the process of finalizing those, overlaying the existing monitoring plans, at least what was proposed in their strategic action plans, like Renee was talking about, and seeing, does the monitoring that they've identified in their results chains match up with what they intended to do at the beginning. If there's some differences or if there's some gaps, then there's an opportunity for them to have some discussions about that. So some of the reflections. So we've already been talking a lot about this. All FIPS are unique. It's always difficult to sort of impose sort of a standardized way of doing things across these sort of diversity of partnerships. And so we've already seen some opportunity for flexibility, so we suggest that there be some flexibility in how the project monitoring framework is structured and used. Scale and context matter. So this has kind of been a big issue, and I'm going to sort of go through this pretty quickly, but as I mentioned, all the FIPS are operating in a larger regional ecosystem regional or ecosystem context. And so the strategic action plan itself is sort of nested within that. And we're developing the progress monitoring framework to sort of match that strategic action plan scaling. And then the scope of work in terms of what work is going to be implemented is still nested within that as well. And so the relative sizes of these rectangles vary depending on the FIPS, where they're working and their context. So if you overlay the results chain on that, the shapes or sort of the results, the strategy implementation, or the long-term ecological impacts fall within various sort of different places within that, of those different kinds of contexts. In some cases, the ecological impacts are way outside. In some cases, they're well within the strategic action plan. Also important to acknowledge that other people are doing work in these similar geographies that are contributing to the results that FIPS are trying to achieve. And so accounting for that, and then sort of building that into a monitoring framework or not building it into a monitoring framework gets a little bit challenging. FIPS are doing monitoring Monitoring is done by others. And so there's an opportunity to integrate the monitoring that the FIPS are proposing to do with things that are ongoing as well, or how the FIPS sort of add value to monitoring that's happening at the larger regional scale. Another reflection is that ownership is really critical and important. It takes a lot of work to manage and steward a progress monitoring framework and a results chain, and so somebody needs to be dedicated to doing that. It can't be sort of the third or fourth things on somebody's job description to sort of do this whenever they have time to. Everybody's really, really busy, especially on project implementation at this time, so we think that it's important that there's somebody who has responsibility and leadership role in managing this piece. Social outcomes are important too. All the FIPS are really interested in figuring out how to build into the results chain in theory, how their work actually provides benefits to the communities, stakeholders, both locally and sort of at larger regional scales. And so we've been working with some of those FIPS to think about how you build in social outcomes along with those ecological outcomes in their results chains. And these things are messy, so like I said, you don't want to go sort of sharing results chains outside of the FIP. And using them as a communications tool. So to help with that, I'll sort of flash a couple of quick graphics. We've been working with the infographic specialists to figure out how to translate results chains or the content material that exists within a results chain into something that's more accessible to a broader audience. In this case, strategies are on the outside, long-term ecological impacts on the inside, time moves from the outside to the inside. So there's just different ways to sort of graphically represent what they're doing. Another graphic that we're trying to show is how FIP partners are contributing to outcomes, but other partners as well are contributing those similar kinds of outcomes. Time moves from left to right here. Those outcomes sort of accumulate, sort of merge, and together that's what's required in order to achieve those long-term desired ecological impacts. And monitoring can occur anywhere along that time continuum. Next steps for us is to complete work with the FIPS, finalize the results chains, do some of that infographics work to figure out how best to translate the materials into easy to read graphics, develop summaries for each of the FIPS that we would then present at the next board meeting.
Okay, thank you. Questions from the board? Dan.
Yeah, first of all, it's like an alliteration panel. We have Renee and Ryan and Robert, and maybe only Randy gets to ask questions. I don't know if there's anybody, but looking at it's kind of cheating because in the staff report too, it also talks about the potential for identifying monitoring gaps. And in that respect, I mean, I kind of see this thing more like a map too, and which also goes to your scale. A one-to-one map is not very useful scale-wise, so you've got to choose where it's going to be and what's important. And I'm guessing you identify the monitoring gaps by setting up your chart and having all those lines and making sure you've got some way to input or to get the data that you need to determine whether the line. Is that how that's going to be used in this identifying monitoring gaps?
Yeah, and it's through that process, sort of that collaborative process of working with members of the FIPS that we sort of recruited to sort of first make sure the results chain is right, pick those things that they think are the most important, and do those things that they pick match the things that they initially decided they wanted to monitor. And if they don't, that's where the gaps are. And it may be that they decide to do a lot more monitoring than what the results chain has, and that's fine, or there's a lot more detail. But as far as this progress monitoring, for the progress monitoring framework, that's kind of how we would.
Okay, Ron. I'm sorry, Alan.
Alan Henning. This is really interesting, and being part of the subcommittee, we've had the opportunity to look at some of the results change, and I can see why you don't want to take them public in the way you have them, because they look like an electronic design of something you have to install, and you don't know any way in which to get to the endpoints. But you can really see how the results change could drive strategic action plans to change strategic action plans because you present everything out there. It looks like it's all-inclusive to the extent that you want it to be. How often has the results chain process changed strategic action plans for the FIPS?
You want me to jump on that one?
Sure.
Yeah. Ryan Houston. I would say with this project, we're not quite there yet, because as we go to the next step of really dialing in the objectives, the metrics, and the monitoring, I think that's where that may come up, or it will likely come up. Reflecting back on my own experience working with BEF over the last 10 years, we ended up calling this thing sort of the truth maker, because once you map it out like this, all the assumptions that were a little fuzzy before get called out, and you can't get away with it anymore. Right. And so for us, working with BEF over the last 10 years, we've changed a lot of things because of the clarity here has just forced us to reflect on it and change and say, I can no longer make that linkage because either I don't have the data or the literature doesn't support it, or I made a logic leap that is too great of a leap, something like that. So I would expect there'll be some evolution. Our goal, our intent here is for that to be a good collaborative process, because the last thing we want to do is sort of show up into all these FIP environments and say, hey, we're here, and sort of
stretching that.
We don't want to overturn the apple cart.
Right.
And so the idea is to have it be a tool that creates reflection and then adaptation as needed.
And this is Renee Davis. The one piece I would add to that is we didn't have the benefit of knowing that this process could be useful and going through the testing period in advance of having those implementation FIP applications come in the door. So the other piece we don't want to do is now that we've gone through this, say, oh, all of your monitoring was completely off base. I suspect that's not going to be the case, frankly, but just have set up these expectations for monitoring to look a certain way when the groups weren't able to benefit from having gone through this process. So have that ability to potentially build out some of the monitoring if needed based on the results of this, but have it be in a way that's workable for the partnerships.
Okay, we have time for one more question, Ron.
Well, thank you, Ron Alvarado. Question on your flow chart, it shows you went from your strategy to implementation results. I'm curious on where the baseline benchmark fits in. Would that be in the strategy, or is that in between those two?
No, that's a good point, and that comes up. Well, there's a couple things that come up. Is that everybody needs to go out and monitor to establish a baseline condition. That sometimes happens. So there's sort of pieces that are deeper within that results chain. So associated with an ecological outcome, you may have certain attributes that you're trying to change over the long term. So you would identify what those are, and then you would identify sort of what's the current condition and how much do you need that to change. So that there's it's a sort of a deeper, more involved process, but it's embedded within that. The other thing is that a lot of times people find they don't have enough information to set up those objectives or to even know what their strategies were going to look like with specificity. And so there's sort of initial assessment, monitoring, or research that needs to be done to sort of support that.
Just to follow up, in some cases, that data is available. I know through Department of Forestry, the conservation strategy, a lot of that information is there. So you're just saying that if it's not, then it would just take that additional monitoring or follow up on that.
Yep.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Look forward to our next report.
All right, we're moving the agenda around slightly, just a reminder if you knew this already. So next up is item N, presentation on collaborative voluntary measures. Renee, Audrey, Kyle, and Kyle Abraham.
Good morning, co-chairs, members of the board. For the record, Renee Davis, Deputy Director. I'm joined by Lena Tucker, who is the Chief of Private Forests at Oregon Department of Forestry, and Kyle Abraham, who's Deputy Chief of Private Forests at ODF. Many of you may remember Kyle, who long ago was OWEB's Effectiveness Monitoring Coordinator, so it's nice to have him back and nice to have Lena here to talk with the board. So we're going to talk with you today under agenda item N about a recent project that we did on collaborative voluntary measures. So I'll just actually make a few very brief opening remarks and then turn it over to Lena before we go into the PowerPoint. So as all of you know, the Oregon Plan, going on, 25 years, actually probably closer to 30 from Coastal Salmon Restoration Initiative, really encouraged what we have come to know as the Oregon Way, which is a combination of both regulatory and non-regulatory approaches is really critical to get some of the conservation outcomes that we desire. So a big piece of that in particular in the Coast Range, but in various areas around the state, has really been work by forest landowners to undertake activities, and whether that be fully voluntary in nature, where there's no contribution from outside funding, just simply that they're bearing the cost and responsibility for that, or in conjunction with incentive programs such as OWEB grants to really help make a difference in terms of restoration, in particular for salmon and steelhead benefits. And so what we did in collaboration with both ODF and with Oregon Forest Resources Institute, OFRI, is to take a look back, a retrospective look at what have some of those actions been on the ground, where have we seen some concentration of activities, whether it be across landowner types or in particular locations, and where might we need some additional effort to reach out and engage some of those forest landowners. So we'll be talking about that with you today. But before we move into the PowerPoint, Lena, I think you have a few opening remarks.
Thanks, Renee. Good morning, and thank you for having us today, members of the board, co-chairs. Again, for the record, my name is Lena Tucker, Division Chief for the Private Forest Division with the Oregon Department of Forestry. I'd like to give you just a little bit more background and context behind this topic, in addition to what Renee did. The Board of Forestry and the state of Oregon have encouraged forest landowners to implement voluntary measures while continuing to support Oregon's forest economy. And so this unique approach includes both regulation under the Oregon Forest Practices Act and then voluntary measures under the Oregon Plan for Salmon and Watersheds to help restore salmon and steelhead habitat and maintain water quality. The Oregon Board of Forestry's 2011 forestry program from Oregon supports efforts under the Oregon Plan to enhance, restore, and protect native salmonid populations and aquatic habitat, while also sustaining a healthy economy. Similarly, the forestry program for Oregon promotes various non-regulatory tools, incentives, landowner assistance, landowner recognition programs to implement forest-related elements that apply to aquatic habitat. And the board's guiding principles and philosophies include a commitment to continuous learning, evaluating and appropriately adjusting forest management policies and programs based upon ongoing monitoring, assessment, and research. So as you may know, the Oregon Forest Practices Act is a cornerstone of Oregon's policy and regulatory framework for protecting resources on non-federal forest land. And this framework really relies on two main regulatory approaches: the Forest Practices Act, of course, and then Oregon's land use planning laws. And these are both augmented by voluntary measures and incentive programs. So together, this makes a three-tiered approach, and it results in Oregon's forest lands having the highest water quality in Oregon. Private landowners and operators are really a critical part of this partnership, as well as our stewardship foresters, who are the boots on the ground, and they wear many hats in the work that they do. They are the connection, and they help keep landowners informed on the suite of voluntary measures and incentives, and they also encourage the importance of reporting those voluntary projects. The key relationships that we've built with OWEB, watershed councils, and OFRI help inform the voluntary measures as well. Ultimately, the voluntary actions rely on a landowner's willingness to plan and execute the actions to produce the greatest results for salmon and water quality. They also have to consider their financial and logistical constraints as well. We want to help them be successful in their land management objectives. So again, our mission here today is to highlight over 20 years of accomplishments, contributions, describe the work that we've done, the many collaborative efforts, and perhaps a little bit about next steps. Where do we want to go to revitalize some of the reporting measures within the program? With that, I'll turn it over again to Kyle and Renee.
Thanks, Lena. So just in terms of a little bit of context, coho salmon were first listed under the Endangered Species Act in 1998. You can see on the graph on the right-hand side of this slide statistics, population statistics from about 1950 until about 2010. So you can see things have been bouncing around a lot through time, but around the time of the red line shown in the listing, populations for coho really reached a critically low level, warranting listing. That said, even prior to the listing, the state was very committed, as I mentioned, to kind of the Oregon approach of a combination of both regulatory and non-regulatory voluntary actions. So some of those actions are voluntary in nature and include improvements that are intended to help aquatic habitat. That could be placement of wood in stream, riparian habitat, whether that's leaving trees standing or undertaking riparian plantings, upland habitat in terms of addressing road issues that might be in landslide-prone areas that could cause huge sediment delivery into streams, and then finally addressing road and stream crossings, especially associated with fish passage. So in terms of the voluntary measures study that we undertook with ODF and with OFRI, we focused on the coastal area that you see shown here in blue, a critical area, as Rosemary and others know, for Coast Coho. And the voluntary measure study really focused on three particular objectives. First, to assess the implementation of voluntary projects that were most frequently conducted by forest landowners. So we have a sense of that, but wanted to really see if the numbers supported that. I'll talk shortly about the data source that we used. It's a database that OWEB has maintained for a number of years. Also to tell success stories of the voluntary restoration measures that have been implemented on forest lands. What's the magnitude of that relative to other implementation? What sense of contribution do we have from the engagement of forest landowners? And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, to begin to identify if there are barriers either to implementation of voluntary projects by forest landowners, or also if we may be bumping up into some reporting challenges that might cause us to not in fact recognize or be able to quantify some of the work that's happening on the ground. So essentially not providing credit where credit's due. And Kyle will talk about a survey, an extensive survey that was conducted to really get at that last issue. So in terms of the source of the information about the restoration projects themselves, we used data that exists in the Oregon Watershed Restoration Inventory, or OWRI. It's a database that OWEB has maintained since 1995, and within that time we've had 17,000 projects reported to the database. So those are not just voluntary projects that were undertaken by forest landowners. Those are projects associated with our funding, for example, other voluntary actions that are undertaken by the implementers of 319 grants, a whole range of different sources of information coming in, but a very robust database. And the intent was really to look at the data from a number of different perspectives. So one, looking at temporal trends. Have we seen any changes through time in the types of voluntary actions that forest landowners are implementing? Are there particular treatment types that are especially popular with forest landowners, or maybe are there some gaps in those? Are there differences among the types of activities that are being implemented by different landowner types? So you'll see the acronyms here. Private industrial is the PI and private non-industrial is the PNI, whether it's state-owned land or other, which largely, Debbie, is federal ownership. And then what are the financial contributions that are associated with those restoration or voluntary restoration actions on the ground? So in terms of the scope of our sample for this, again, Oregon Coast Range, which I showed you the map of earlier, 20 years of projects, as Lena mentioned, so focused on a period from 95 to 2014. And all told, we're talking about over 5,600 projects that were implemented on forest lands. 80% of those are what we deemed, for the purpose of this study, conventional. So those are the projects that I mentioned earlier that are fully just taken on voluntarily by forest landowners. It's not associated with any type of a grant or incentive program. So more than 80% of the projects within the sample are of that conventional nature. And all told, those projects basically account for about $162 million in investment, so quite significant in nature. So in looking at some of the trends through time and where projects have concentrated, so you see, if you look At the 4 panels from left to right, we're talking about 5-year chunks from 99 up through 2014. This is basically a heat map, so cooler colors mean that some projects were happening, hotter colors mean a lot of projects were happening in those particular locations. So overall, going from left to right, you can see that we've had fewer projects reported over time. Early on, a lot of projects happening up and down the geographic area of interest here, and you can see some particular hotspots up on the north coast, around Newport, and then down around Coos Bay. If you go to the second panel, even hotter spots up on the north coast, but starting to see maybe a little bit of lessening in density, especially as you move south, and then continuing to see less density in terms of the projects that were reported as having occurred on forest lands through time. And I won't make any statements about why. I'm sure that Kyle and Lena have some ideas about through time, maybe why that has evolved in the way that it has. So for that geographic area, just by way of context in terms of the ownership coverage in the area, so you can see about 1/3 in the yellow is owned by private industrial timberland. About 1/3 is owned in that other category, so again, primarily federal lands. And then the remaining 1/3 of that pie chart is a split between the non-industrial and then state-owned lands. So that's just to give you a sense overall of the ownership. But if you move to the bar chart and looking at the number of projects across those ownership types that were included in the sample pool, you see that by and large, the reporting from the private industrial landowners makes up the bulk of the sample pool that we looked at. So over 4,000 projects, and then quite a number associated with state lands, and then much fewer in terms of that non-industrial reporting. The other, I want to give credit where credit's due. It's not that there isn't work happening on federal lands, but in terms of reporting, there's no requirement for the feds to report into OWRI. We have historically shared information across databases, but not merged them into a single database. So Debbie, I'm sure, could provide a point to many Forest Service databases over the years that account for literally thousands of projects that simply aren't reflected in OWRI.
And BLM too.
And BLM, yes, correct, and BLM too. And so when you start looking at the actual treatments that were undertaken, so by far the largest or most popular treatment type is associated with road treatments. You see that in the top left graph. This does not account for road surveys. These are simply treatments that were done on roads. And you see that the state makes up a huge proportion of that, as does the industrial landowner community. And that nearly all of those projects are those conventional types in nature. They took that on as a responsibility of their own rather than doing that work associated with an incentives program. The second most popular treatment type reported is around in-stream structure. So again, example of placing large wood in stream. You see that you really start to see a shift with that particular treatment type. Much heavier reliance on what we have called incentives-based, so really grant programs. And not certain if that's because these projects are more expensive, if there's more complexity to it, they're a better fit for a grant. But across the ownership types, definitely seeing a much stronger role for grant programs such as OWEBs and others with that particular activity type. Also, and I think that you'll see it quite a lot more in the next graphs, we have seen consistency in the non-industrial landowner type relying much more on engagement through incentives programs as opposed to that kind of taking it on fully on their own and bearing all of the cost and responsibility for that. So that's one of those items to keep in your head as Kyle starts talking about the survey in just a bit. So the third and fourth most popular treatment types that we saw on forest lands were fish access to habitat, so essentially fish passage projects. That's in the bottom right figure. Again, you see quite a big difference if you look at just the non-industrial and industrial landowner types. A lot of work in this arena by private industrial, most of it in that conventional way of doing business. Non-industrial, much less activity, and again, a heavy reliance on engagement with grant programs to do this work. And a similar pattern holds in terms of the improved riparian forest, whether that's leaf tree or riparian planting. So, go ahead, Laura.
Laura Masterson, on your last slide, what does it mean to treat a road? Does that mean they took it out, or?
Kyle Abraham, I guess that's how you guys do it here. Gained a little bit, different than when I was here before.
Audio
but
minutes.
So treating roads could be a number of things. It could be cross drains. It could be resurfacing. So adding new rock. It could be, there's another category for decommissioning or vacating roads. That's not part of this. So usually it's cross drains, ditch line improvement, some other things like that.
So it's basically something that decreases erosion.
Correct.
A variety, a suite of,
Erosion and also the potential for sediment delivery.
like a landslide or a washout or something.
Correct.
Okay,
Yep.
thank you.
So with that, I'll turn it over to Kyle to walk you through the survey results.
So I'll drill down a little bit, but also Kyle Abraham, Deputy Chief for Private Forest Division, board members, co-chairs, Executive Director Lofsgarden, thank you for having us here today. One thing I'd like to mention also is that we did a similar presentation to the Board of Forestry just last month, and so really appreciate Renee and her efforts, and Audrey, and also the efforts of OFRI, who also presented with us there. So I'll, again, sort of drill into a little bit of the survey, try to keep it brief. Spring of 2016, Davis, Hibbets, and Midgall from Portland, DHM as they're commonly known, conducted an online survey of private forest landowners owning 10 or more acres in Oregon's Coast Range on behalf of the partnership. The purpose of the survey was to determine landowners' current engagement with completing and reporting voluntary projects to improve watershed conditions in response to the Oregon Plan for Salmon and Watersheds, and to identify barriers to engagement. And part of that excerpt is in the materials that you have in front of you. So basically, that was a 20-question survey. We utilized the Partnership for Forestry Education database, which is another partnership that we've developed with OSU Extension and OFRI that helps us identify, particularly in the small landowner category, who owns forest land. And so it makes it easier for us to target some of our materials and information to small landowners. We also use the OWRI respondent list, which is basically emails and any information we could glean from OWRI. We had almost 2,500 landowners participate in the survey, 236 responses, which is roughly trying to round up to about 10% response rate. We also advertised in the Oregon Small Woodlands Association newsletter, and ODF and OWEB, Executive Director Lofsgarden, and at the time State Forester Decker signed a postcard that went out to landowners. We did 2 mailings, and within that postcard was a web link with a unique password for landowners to access the survey. Just a couple quick things. The majority of the survey participants were males, older than 55 years old, and many of them had more than 10 years experience managing forest resources. 1/2 of the participants managed less than 70 acres, and the other half managed more than 70 acres. So pretty close, just for some demographics. You also have some example questions. One of them basically is, have you ever completed a voluntary project? And so there's some different pathways in there where we didn't make people fill out the whole survey if they've never done a voluntary project. What has prevented you from completing voluntary projects, and what would be most helpful for you if you consider a voluntary project? So some of the results, this is good news. Over 50% of the people that responded were familiar with the Oregon Plan, which actually is pretty impressive. I wish there were other things that people were so knowledgeable about, but anyway. 75% had completed voluntary projects, but remember, completed doesn't necessarily mean reported. And some of the data suggests that only 20% had reported a voluntary project. So reporting is an inconsistent practice even among people who have reported in the past. Some of them also identified a lacked awareness on how to report. A majority, 58%, said they completed a project that they did not report, and almost 80% of those who had completed and reported a project, and 72% of those who had completed but not reported a project said they completed a voluntary project that went unreported at least once, which also identifies reporting as an inconsistent practice for people that have implemented more than one project. So a few more survey results. Again, sort of unaware that people could report, do not understand the value or benefit of reporting, and unsure where to report. Reasons for not reporting include doing the right thing, becoming best practices. Over time, some of the low-hanging fruit has been identified and basically picked already, so many of the projects have become more complicated and probably consist of some work with OWEB or other partners to get that completed. And then the big one also, unsure of the value of reporting, which I think we will get to a little bit in the next steps. Larger landowners with more than 10 years experience in managing forests were most likely to report and also be familiar with the Oregon plan. So again, sort of the key message is the smaller landowners with less experience are the ones that we're trying to provide some of the information and next steps for. I think one more slide. So how do we increase the completion of projects? And the survey respondents identified cost sharing, so some of the work that you all do and maybe some other potential pilot projects, tax incentives, regulatory assurances, and training on how to properly conduct projects was mentioned 37% of the time. So again, focusing on smaller landowners with less experience, some of the educational tools that came out of the survey was a color illustrated guide describing best practices, recommendations by stewardship foresters, watershed councils, a website dedicated to voluntary projects, and also a forum for landowners to sort of share their experiences with voluntary projects and what worked for them, what didn't. So another avenue to reach people that are doing this kind of work.
Renee Davis. So in terms of next steps, this is the first time that we have come together and really delved into what do all of those data within OWEB tell us, especially in conjunction with some follow-up surveys to really get straight from the landowners what their experience has been with reporting and maybe what some of those obstacles and opportunities might be. So some of the next steps that are quite obvious from our perspective is, one, to pursue some of those pathways that Kyle mentioned as possibilities for engaging more private non-industrial landowners in implementing projects, especially if you overlay where particularly high priority habitat restoration or high priority existing habitat is for coast coho as we look towards ongoing recovery and hopefully eventual delisting of those species. There's a huge nexus with private non-industrial land ownership. So really figuring out how to differently and better engage those folks in restoration on the ground. Also, based on the survey findings, there's no question that work is happening on the ground that simply isn't being reported. So determining what are some of those things that might be limiting their ability or interest in reporting, and whether that's that we have a very cumbersome reporting process that it's really structured more for folks who are engaged in incentives or grant-making programs, and is there a possibility for streamlining that to really get a better handle on what some of those voluntary actions are by landowners who simply are in the space of, it's the right thing to do, I do this all the time on my land, I don't see the value or need for reporting, it's just part of my business practice now. Assessing how implementation and reporting change over time. We've definitely seen a decrease across land ownership in terms of reporting by forest land owners, but determining is there a way to possibly bump that up, both on the reporting side, but again, by maybe engaging more landowners, in particular the private non-industrial, in some of these activities. And then to some of the larger questions of the need for monitoring project, both implementation, but then also effectiveness, really starting to get a better handle on not just those outputs of saying we know X number of projects have put this much wood in stream, but what is that connection to fish populations? How is that improving habitat in a way that hopefully will increase population viability? So some of those longer term needs that certainly you as a board have been talking about a lot more in recent months and years. So those are some of the next steps that we have identified, knowing that resources across state agencies are sometimes challenging to find. We don't have a particular work plan. We are going to be convening hopefully next month OWEB, ODF, and OFRI to come together and talk through maybe what some of those priorities might be in terms of next steps and what some reasonable timeframes might be for pursuing those. So with that, happy to take any questions you might have.
Dan?
Yeah, Dan Thorndike. I'm struck by the comment, what's both in report and in the staff report, that says the majority of coho habitat is found throughout private non-industrial forests. I wonder if you could expand on that a bit and explain maybe why that's the case. I mean, is there just a different geography? Does that also lead to the different results? It surprised me a bit to hear that.
Yeah, Kyle Abraham. So that is some of the research that we did when we implemented the new riparian rules, identified, and this has been also researched by other folks within the Forest Service, the research lab. Basically, it is geography. So those forest lands are in some of the more productive habitat, some of the lower gradient habitat with floodplain connectivity, and just based on where they are within the landscape, that provides.
So you see, so it's the stuff that would be closer to the coast rather than up higher in the mountains. So it's again, that would be typically more diverse ownership, smaller ownerships, private non-industrial. Okay.
Yeah. So I think of it as lower in the watershed.
Okay, lower in the watershed. Got it. Thanks.
Rosemary.
Rosemary Furphy, thank you for your report. I think it is an interesting point you're making, Dan. It also shows the settlement patterns and where the private land was in those bottomland areas versus higher in the habitat that may have been more O&C lands and federal lands. One interesting thing, given how limited budgets are these days, it might be interesting to look at your private non-industrial and the high intrinsic habitat potential for coho. Mm-hmm. Those maps, which I think could be overlaid pretty quickly to see where you might focus in on with regard to coho recovery. So I think that could be an interesting overlay and maybe help you target and thereby save some money on what might be the most productive actions for recovery. Mm-hmm. Thanks for this effort.
Thank you.
Ellen, did you have something? No.
Alan Henning. Hey, Kyle. Hey, Alan. One of the questions, and Renee, I think you got to it on the last line of the last slide. It was about monitoring. So what is the QA/QC tool that you use to look at voluntary measures to make sure that voluntary measures are where you are being implemented in the way in which they're effective? And so if you have a lot of roads work, you know that the roads work that people are putting in, that people are doing on a voluntary basis are in fact in the right place, doing the right thing, helping in the right way.
Thanks, Alan. Renee Davis. So I'll speak to this from the standpoint of a funder that supports this type of work, knowing that our grantees have a responsibility for post-implementation status reporting for multiple years, anywhere from 3 to 5 years, typically post-project. So we do have a sense of, what is that kind of implementation record, if you will, and did it play out the way that we expected it to? And we're in the process of trying to better understand some lessons learned from that. Are there kind of best practices or learnings that we could gather from that to continue to improve implementation? Can you, Kyle, speak to more of the voluntary conventional?
So Kyle Abraham, that's a good question, Alan. Some of the things that we've talked about here today are practices that go above and beyond the Forest Practices Act. So, if they're doing something that is not part of the regulation. And frankly, we've struggled with that over time, and we've identified these questions a number of years ago in our previous monitoring strategy to test the effectiveness of Oregon plan measures, and that's sort of the things that we're trying to get at now. Some of these things that we presented today are sort of the first steps along the way to identify some of the other things that we can provide some more credibility and quality assurance, quality control for voluntary projects.
Bob, Debbie, I had a comment.
I thank you for your report, Bob Weber. And I guess I'm...
All of us need to make our comments quick because we're getting close to noon here.
Okay, so I think I'm probably the only one here that actually lives in the area, have riparian river front, and when Mother Nature delivers a log, I sometimes go down and move it around to where I think it'll stay as opposed to just become driftwood down on the beach. Is that a project?
Did you report it?
No, I didn't report it.
Okay.
Thank you for the question, Bob. Renee Davis. I would say that probably is not a project.
It might be for you.
If you so desire to report that, I'm not exactly sure what fields you would complete the database, but we could explore that. No, I don't think that's a project.
Yep. Debbie?
So I have a question in terms of how this relates to a holistic approach, because it seems like we've focused in on forest activities, and so I'm wondering about the ag activities that are also happening in those areas, and what's the process or plan to make this a holistic approach, so ag, forest, all the way up.
Thanks, Debbie. Renee Davis. There's no plan in place to do a comparable voluntary measures project with Department of Ag, for example, for a few reasons. One is we frankly would not see as much of that kind of conventional reporting from the agricultural community, and that's not a critique. That just was a huge push with forest landowners, especially early in the longevity of the Oregon plan. That said, we do have so the Conservation Effectiveness Partnership that Audrey will talk with you about shortly, it will help to give you a sense of how we are starting to better understand what those actions have been, not just in the coast, but in various places on primarily agricultural lands, where we've seen some water quality issues, and what not just the outputs in terms of the projects that have been put on the ground have been, but starting to see what are some of those shifts in terms of ecosystem function and process. And then also through one of the governor's priorities that the board funded the last 2 biennia, the Clean Water Partnership, certainly more interagency conversations about if we're talking about water quality issues, that's not just a forestry issue, that is an ag issue, that's a rural residential issue, and how do you better get at the range of impacts and restoration or conservation needs?
So I my 2 quick comments, and then I think we need to move on. So the first, it's always great to see how much work is being done on the ground. At the same time, I always have this sort of schizophrenic reaction, and I recognize that this wasn't intended to address all of these, but one of them is during those 20 years, there's also been harvest going on. And so there's been roads put in, sediment coming in, trees coming down so that there's lack of shade. So not addressing the net impact, there's all this good work, but there's also negative work that's been going on. And so it's hard to evaluate whether we're making progress, if you will. Related to, not that not doing these would ever be better, but and related a little bit to Rosemary's is sort of the relationship to goals. So, is this good progress, poor progress, great progress towards how many acres, miles, treatments are needed to achieve the recovery goals in a certain time frame? It's interesting, but it doesn't tell me, answers. So I think unless there's something really urgent, we need to move on to give Audrey a chance to present and so forth.
I just wanted to say to Debbie,
that's
I already
Laura
wrote it
Masterson.
down. Laura Masterson, to talk to the board and Alexis about it.
If you want. about the ag part of it. I already wrote it down. To talk to the board about.
Okay. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, you guys.
We're gonna, this is Randy Labby, co-chair. We're going to move into item M, tab M, Conservation Effectiveness Partnership Update. Renee's just going to move her seat, and Audrey Hatch, our Conservation Outcomes Coordinator, is going to join her.
This will be my last time saying good morning to you all, partly because it's almost the afternoon. Good morning, co-chairs.
Are you planning to present another thing in the afternoon, just so we?
No.
Okay.
We are done. You can get the hook and pull me off. For the record, Renee Davis, Deputy Director. Last presentation of the day, unless other business has come up. So this is item N, Conservation Effectiveness Partnership. Thank you, Debbie, for the tee up with your last question. So Audrey's going to walk you through a great presentation to give you a better sense of what the Conservation Effectiveness Partnership, or CEP, is. Just briefly, it's an interagency collaboration across a collection of both state and federal agencies with the specific intent of really looking at the effectiveness of conservation and restoration actions in a particular location, and not just looking at the outputs from those, but really what are those improvements in terms of ecosystem function and process through time. CEP looks at specific areas where there's been significant restoration investment. Oftentimes it's investment by OWEB, NRCS, but there could be other funders included in that. Then overlays where those areas exist where there have historically been water quality issues. Once we've done that overlay and determined where there has been a lot of action, we have some time series in terms of water quality data, and then coming together with local partners within that area to identify specific questions that we can answer about how have certain actions on the ground impacted positively, hopefully, but maybe not, water quality, given that that was oftentimes the intent of that work. So I think CEP, you'll learn, is a really nice model for some of the telling the restoration story that we've been talking about. Certainly the monitoring subcommittee has been talking about. The other piece I would just highlight is it's been an incredibly productive interagency collaboration. It's created a great forum to come together, talk through how do we really leverage the strengths across different agencies, how to tackle issues like data sharing, which can be challenging, but you can find solutions on if you kind of come together and talk through both constraints and what's possible. So huge thanks to Laura on behalf of staff from ODA who've participated in that. Huge thanks, Bob. ODFW has recently come on board in more of a technical advisor role. It's been great to start connecting up the water quality data with some of the fish information. And Ron, of course, just huge thanks to your staff for participating in that. And then also staff from DEQ are involved. So if we had an EQC rep, I would certainly want to call out the importance of that involvement. So the last thing I'll say before turning it over to Audrey is having Audrey in the Conservation Outcomes Coordinator position has added enormous horsepower to the CEP effort, ranging from putting together agendas and facilitating meetings and really making sure that we're continuing to make consistent progress on some of these interagency conversations. So thank you, Audrey, for that work in the last 10 months.
Thank you, Renee, and thank you, co-chairs and members of the board. And what I'd like to do is just provide an update about OWEB's engagement in the Conservation Effectiveness Partnership, and take a little bit of time to just describe the watershed case study approach that has proven really successful for the group, and conclude with some next steps. And I'll just kind of tee up that last item by saying the group is really looking at how to share results of collaborative conservation with different audiences, with conservation practitioners and implementers, folks that work with landowners, also with the Natural Resources Agency, program managers and decision makers and policymakers. So just recognizing there are different folks out there that are interested in the results of this work. And as Renee described, CEP is an interagency collaboration that really emphasizes monitoring and reporting, but it's really about sharing the story and the lessons learned, engaging staff from ODA, from DEQ, NRCS, and OWEB to evaluate the effectiveness of our investments together. So specifically in 2010, those 4 agencies established a memorandum to commit to the partnership, and that is really continuing on through at least 2020. And then in 2016, the Department of Fish and Wildlife stepped in that advisory role to really help the team kind of connect the dots in looking at what are our investments doing to really contribute to quality fish habitat. So together, the Conservation Effectiveness Partnership agencies have agreed on a mission, and you can take a look at that at the moment, and then we'll share some of the specific goals that the agencies involved have really agreed on together. Agencies have come together really recognizing they face similar challenges, they face similar struggles, and have found quite a bit of value in working together in sharing their strengths and also looking for economies of scale and efficiencies. And so as has been described kind of earlier today and earlier in this meeting and past meetings, a lot of folks are really interested in better telling the story of what our investments are accomplishing out there, and it's really focused on the ecological outcome, on the issue and the uplift that we want to see. So it's seeing this need bubble up from different agencies really kind of led to CEP coming together and saying, we all share this struggle and this challenge. Let's combine our strengths and leverage them. So to focus efforts, the Effectiveness Partnership agencies really agreed on kind of some specific goals. And they're really focused on water quality and water quality issues and what's happening in watersheds where there's some agricultural influence. Key points are also CEP is really also is looking at how local organizations are using the different agency grant programs kind of together in concert. So recognizing there may be, individual programs out there with reporting structures, but what we're trying to get at with CEP is how are things really playing out together in concert. So to do that, CEP has developed some criteria. Renee mentioned the word overlay. So looking at where multiple agencies have invested. And I think about the conversation that we started on Monday at this meeting as well about really bringing the best available science to bear along with that local knowledge in concert is a big part of what CEP is about. Helping groups tell the story and recognizing there are different folks interested in the story and what are they looking for, what results can we share with them that are appropriate to different audiences. And so next I'll kind of talk through how the watershed case study approach has helped the group focus on specific issues and frame up questions relevant to a particular watershed and how that approach can help kind of provide a model for other conservation practitioners to draw from. So briefly, criteria to select watersheds to delve into for kind of the case study approach are areas where there have been multiple agency investments in water quality, where there's an agricultural influence, and where there are monitoring results available. So ideally, before and after practices, and ideally monitoring results available relevant to the variables of highest interest related to water quality. Those are some of the scientific criteria that the group has really used to identify watersheds for case studies, but it's key to have local partners involved and engaged, and I'll go through briefly examples of 4 watershed case studies that the group has delved into and kind of illustrate what we mean by that. And again, that kind of bringing local knowledge and local involvement to bear along with the best available science. So briefly, the group has done significant work in 6 watersheds throughout Oregon, and today, just to show you the breadth of the approach, I'll talk about 4 of them: the Wilson River, 15 Mile Creek, Prairie Creek, and Dairy Creek. And you've got a handout of the Wilson River fact sheet that's been completed in your book. There's a fact sheet completed on the 15-mile study, and work is actively underway now on Prairie Creek and Dairy Creek. And so thinking about the Wilson River in the Tillamook Basin, really that kind of lower 8 or so miles of the Wilson River flowing right through where there's a lot of dairy activity near the city of Tillamook as well, where there are development pressures. There was a concern that was really recognized about bacteria levels being, too high above the recreational use standard. Local partners got together, and conservation partners, as well as the Tillamook Creamery Association and the Tillamook Estuary Partnership in this case, and said, what can we do to really, solve this problem? And a couple examples of things that they looked at were ways to improve riparian habitat, lots of ways to reduce, or looking at different ways to reduce runoff, manure storage. And key to the CEP watershed approach was the partners got together and said, we really need to monitor the bacteria levels, and let's look at where the best place is to do that. Let's look for funding if we need to do that better. The CEP came and helped with data analysis and with compilation. You see a fact sheet that's in your book, and kind of completed that status update, but is now really continuing to check in with local partners and see how this issue is playing out over time, and how other watersheds, and particularly in the North Coast, may be able to learn from some of the successful approaches that were applied there. Another watershed case study approach that the group has successfully completed is in Wasco County, north central Oregon. So 15 Mile Creek, there historically were a lot of dry land agricultural practices, a couple of factors that really led to concerns about erosion, about loss of healthy soil, also water quality concerns in the area. Again, local partners came together and invested in a couple different key things here. In addition to riparian work and riparian planting, looked at no-till agricultural practices and also forest management practices in the area to look at what they could do to improve water quality and along with that, soil health. So in 15 Mile Creek, restoration really started in the early 1990s. So this is a nice case study for the Conservation Effectiveness Partnership, having some data available. And DEQ monitoring continues, and in 2016, DEQ was able to work within the technical team to kind of do some data comparisons, looking at how conditions were in fact playing out in 15 Mile Creek over time. And there are continuing conversations in the area convened by Department of Agriculture, and how to continue to monitor and really evaluate success over time. One thing that the group learned from 15 Mile Creek was that the Conservation Effectiveness Partnership group can bring that expertise to the table to help local folks look at the whole watershed. That was what the group really kind of heard the value in the CEP approach being, and we've kind of found that to continue. We've heard that from folks in working within Prairie Creek and also in Dairy Creek. The last 2 case studies I'll briefly touch on, which are currently underway. So thinking about the Prairie Creek watershed is near the town of Joseph, and this is Wallowa Lake here. And so this is a system, as some of us were, I know, chatting on the field trip yesterday. Similarly, the Prairie Creek watershed has kind of an unusual flow regime, and that lots of flow, lots of canals and ditches have been built to move water, resulting in really high flows throughout the creek. there was a need recognized to invest in improvements in efficiencies. We don't want to waste water. We don't want to have water running through fields and leading to water quality problems. So lots of investments beginning in the 1990s. For the Conservation Effectiveness Partnership, this was a great case study because you have this historic information and monitoring data collected in the 1990s and able to compare that with a recent study done by Wallowa SWCD, and to compare those results and kind of look at what are the outcomes there. So really briefly, projects on the ground, irrigation improvement projects, did result in improved bacteria and nutrient levels observed in data from the 90s and observed in recent data. We did see a decrease in variability when comparing the two different periods of time. So the more recent data had less variability than the data from the 1990s, particularly looking at nutrient levels, phosphorus. However, it's still really difficult to parse out the actual cause and the effect across the landscape, and it's not entirely a clear-cut story. One thing that makes it a little challenging in Prairie Creek is just a lack of stream flow data collected in all the places where we would like to have that. So it makes it a little difficult to tell a clear story here, but this is a good example of where that information from the 90s can be compared with recent data looking at similar variables of interest in terms of water quality. And also a nice example case study where we hear what local folks are doing, how they're finding value in the different agency grant programs working together and really finding value in that collaborative approach. It's helping them apply for grants. It's helping them look at ways to improve fish passage. And it's helping them look at how they might want to plan for drought or other changes that they might see on the horizon in the area. Dairy Creek, so the first three watershed case studies that I touched on, the Wilson, 15 Mile, and Prairie Creek, were examples of the group coming together and looking at what information do we have, what's it telling us, and let's dive into the details a little bit. Dairy Creek's a little different in that it's the group taking that approach, but also looking forward and sitting down with local partners and saying, what might we want to do next, or looking ahead a little bit. So it's a prospective case study up in the Tualatin Basin. Department of Agriculture and NRCS especially have invested a fair amount in this area. It's a very visible watershed in that Highway 26 goes right there. And there's also a lot of interest in the fish habitat. And so currently CEP partners are sitting down with local partners and establishing kind of a work plan to find out where their goals align and what value the CEP can bring. Again, hearing from folks that there is value in taking this whole watershed approach and looking at how what happens in Dairy Creek contributes to the whole Tualatin. We've also gotten some questions about a little bit beyond the scope of the CEP, but interest from local partners in looking at songbird impacts, perhaps. Our songbird community is responding to restoration, so helping them find a way that they might want to ask that question or find an avenue to pursue asking that question. And so this is a prospective watershed work is currently underway, sitting down with local partners to step through a work plan with the intention of kind of completing a status update, I'll call it, by about May of 2019, just to check in and see where we are and give us a scope and time frame to the project. So finally, I'll step through what we see as some of the key next steps on the horizon. Like I mentioned, the CEP agencies have committed to continue the partnership through at least 2020. And so some of the key next steps include getting the word out through the case studies about what's working in some of the watersheds that the group has looked at. And how can we help, as a kind of statewide group, help local partners tell the story about their investments? We also, though, want to use the opportunity to talk frankly about some of the challenges. And so we hear from folks that we don't always have enough data to really look at the questions of interest. Sometimes the data is there, but it's really difficult to find. That's where a lot of the agency folks, specifically DEQ, can really kind of help mine data and bring data to bear on relevant questions. So those are some of the challenges that the group is really kind of working through, and learning a lot about what the agency programs and partners, what strengths can they bring to the table with this group. So there is, as Renee mentioned, there's an interagency kind of approach to the CEP, but I think a key aspect of it is really also the kind of meeting structure. So there's a forum for technical folks to meet every month and share progress on these case studies, raise questions that have come up, share information that we've learned. A quarterly process to bring the managers of folks together, and an annual opportunity to meet with the involved agency directors. And we held our 2017 meeting was just last week. And it's a great opportunity to really engage and continue to build the buy-in within agencies to proceed with the CEP interagency approach, and kind of get some guidance on the direction that the group is heading. So it's an opportunity through these kind of continuing this forum to talk about cross-cutting issues, like are there ways that we can better share data among the agencies better? And there's an opportunity to talk through the technical issues that sometimes go with that, about data compatibility, about timing and workflow, but also some of the issues surrounding messaging as agencies come together to work with watershed groups. So the watershed case studies are continuing to be underway. There's an effort to kind of look back at what has worked, what is the status of some of the past watersheds that the group has looked at. And the group is also continuing to improve ways to share outcomes with various audiences, with implementers and conservation practitioners, in a way that they can learn some lessons from the different watershed case studies, but also with natural resources program managers and other funders, natural resources program managers with funders and policymakers as well. And so the group is exploring some web-based tools that might be able to share, kind of take the paper case study approach into an online format in a way that also lets the conservation practitioners delve into some of the details. And so on the screen right now is an example of the type of tool the group is looking at. This is an Esri story map that can show, as Renee mentioned, the word overlay, kind of show where the investments are happening, where the monitoring stations are related to what's happening, and then look at the results in comparison to sampling sites and in comparison to places where there are investments. So that type of detail might be of interest to practitioners and implementers, and the group is looking at ways to ways to tell that story and make use of technology. So I would conclude by just saying Conservation Effectiveness Partnership, if we were to describe it in a couple of words, it's about outreach and it's about interpretation.
Thank you. Questions for Audrey or Renee on this? I have one, Randy Levy. Audrey, what's the catalyst for, how are your projects selected?
Yeah, thanks. So the watershed case studies are really selected by, there's an interest in getting some representation throughout the state, but that's rather informal. So they're really done by looking at where have agencies invested in projects to improve agricultural water quality, to scope it down a little bit. So where might there be NRCS focus areas, where might there be Department of Agriculture focus areas and SIAs, where those types of overlays. And then from there, we look at somewhat informally, where is there also good monitoring data in relation to these projects? And we've found the Prairie Creek is a good example of that, where there's actually, specific reports that we can draw from. That's not always the case, but we will when we look at kind of an overlay of where our agency is investing in these types of projects. Informally look through our files, and CEP partner agencies will all kind of go back and look and see what data is there that we might be able to bring to bear. Another example is in Dairy Creek, we learned about a Portland State University study that had some relevant data. So the scientific criteria are really kind of the location, where is there multiple overlay or interest among the agencies, where is their data available, hopefully before and after restoration practices. But then again, we really want to we want to hear from local partners what's working for them. So we'll also initiate conversations informally with agency folks about, well, how, what's going on in this watershed with this council, or what are folks hearing out there about 15 Mile? Is this a good place to go and work?
Thanks. Will?
Just a very quick thing on your very last point about online presence. I Googled conservation effectiveness partnership during this, and the only thing that shows up is the memo that we have in our board book today. So it's hard to find anything about what's going on, including the reports that have actually been produced already. So looking forward to that.
Thanks, Will. Renee Davis. So this partly is to the point of what we talked about on Monday over cocktails, which is paper outreach is not the only method and mechanism that we should be using. We need to be using some tools that help people to access things differently and at different levels. So certainly the Esri tool that Audrey mentioned is a critical one for us to, I think, venture into that. We also, though, have been really clear on we're not interested in having a big branding campaign around conservation effectiveness partnerships. So the key for us is really providing the necessary outreach to help folks understand the approach that's used and to help them tell some of those local stories of success, or where work is still being done. So we are trying to balance those two things.
Just Will Newhouser, just to follow up on the other flip side of that is kudos to OWEB that today's board book already shows up when you when you Google.
Debbie.
Thanks for the presentation. It gives me a lot of interesting ideas. So I just want to make sure I fully understand. So this is really an interagency collaboration. There's no extra money. There's no grant. Every agency is coming to the table with their own resources. They're not sharing funds. They're just saying this is important work that we do together, and they're investing resources through their individual programs of work. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that is correct. The piece I would say is it is through our budget, but having Audrey's position has been a critical add, but that is through OWEB agency resources.
Right, so it's agency, so it's a matter of prioritizing programs of work and, if you will, what Audrey's working on, right? So we have this position, she's working on this, or we're choosing to have her work on something else. So it's a prioritization capacity question by each agency that each agency is making independently to be at the table.
If I could add briefly to that as well, I think when we have our conversations with local partners about watershed case studies, about what's working, what data do you have, what do you want to look at, we have a conversation like this about, well, the CEP group can bring some expertise to bear, it can bring a statewide view to bear, it can bring an opportunity to look at the whole watershed to bear, but exactly what you described about, we're not a new funding source is a conversation that we have with each of these case studies.
Rosemary and then Will.
This is very exciting. Thank you, Audrey. I actually went back to our spend plan and the key elements we were looking at with regard to monitoring grants, program effectiveness monitoring, and I hope we can have the conversation of how this effort can potentially help answer some of the board questions of telling that OWEB story, for example, in the Rogue Valley. What's the outcome of that investment over 20 years? So I'm hoping maybe this is something for the monitoring committee. We can be looking at how this effort can also help the board, help OWEB tell that story, or also the methods and the coordination that you are showing and the results you can show, that may be helpful for watershed councils or other groups. That I think we're trying to get the message out. We're trying to understand what are the results of all the work that's been done over time. You now have case studies to show that, and that may become templates that we can use both in the funding we do in the next 2 years and help answer some of the questions the board has with regard to OWEB's overall effectiveness. So thank you, and maybe our committee can think about how to make use of this.
And so just briefly, because I know we're standing between you and lunch, our vision with that programmatic effectiveness monitoring line item and the telling the story piece is, one, CEP is an incredible model for how we might do that, and two, figuring out, is there some potential to leveraging resources in that line item to maybe do some additional case studies via CEP. So I think it can be a two-directional potential conversation, action area that certainly we'll be talking about in the monitoring subcommittee.
Well,
so I had a crazy idea, so I'll just throw it out there. So in the discussion about the criteria, it occurs to me that the reasons to not pick an area might also be useful information. And that if you're looking at an area, I don't know, I'm just going to throw random things out there that I have no idea about the data, the Powder River Subbasin or Rogue, and the conclusion is we don't have the data to do the evaluation. That might be useful information for us to know about future funding in that area, that it should at least be conditioned on the appropriate data that we would be able to come up with results at some point. So it might be a way to feed back to the funding side as well, that if we're spending, we already know a lot of agencies are spending a lot of money, but we're not collecting enough data to be able to produce a report. Either we shouldn't spend that money or we need to fix the data problem.
Right. I'll just add really briefly. I know we are between here and lunch, but I will add briefly that some of the questions the CEP has been able to frame it's been really useful to be able to bring those into other water quality monitoring groups that meet throughout the state to ask, are we missing anything in terms of data? And as you mentioned, if you Google this group, you don't find anything. It is very difficult to find some of the data in a statewide repository to really answer the important questions. So we are attempting to, I'd say we're beginning to attempt to document that exact process.
okay, thanks very much. And is there any new business to come before the board? Okay, well, we're adjourned, and thanks so much to the board and to the staff and to the presenters.